This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
You have declared a subliminal jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell on a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the Temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people that had so much to gain and had such an ulterior motive for putting me in a position I'm in will never let the true facts come above board to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember his name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions, Jack.
Yes.
Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 41. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today we're going to tackle a book that I think rightfully deserves to be up on the Pantheon bookshelf for Subliminal Jihad in general.
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much one that vibes in a certain, maybe oblique way with the previous, or some of the previous books, such as S.K. Bain's books. There's definitely a Bainly vibe to this book. I hadn't read it before, so I didn't really expect it, but there definitely is a bit of a Bainly vibe here. Lots of a surprising number of mentions of like Crowley and a lot of like astrological speculations involving like dates of things happening.
Noting who was born on the winter solstice or the autumnal equinox or on Aleister Crowley's birthday, which a number of the events in this book do happen on October 12th. But yeah, it is a very interesting and impressive work. It's something that I discovered maybe about 5 years ago. And this, of course, is Dave McGowan's, the late, great Dave McGowan's Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, Laurel Canyon, Covert Ops, and the Dark Heart of the Hippie Dream, which I think he published, I want to say maybe around in like 2014 actually is when this came out. So I probably first heard about this book in 2015, and I think Dave McGowan passed away around that time. He got cancer, and then and not unlike Mae Brussel in the 1980s, came down with a very fast-acting form of cancer, and he was kind of taken away from us all too soon, I think, because he does have this. He's unique in a couple different ways. I mean, he's somebody who's delved into a lot of the topics that we've covered, obviously, in our Grateful Dead episode, that ties into this heavily, but also the idea of like the Monarch program, MK Ultra. His previous book, Program to Kill, had a lot about kind of, a lot of that hypothesis that I think we touched on before, the idea that somehow the proliferation of serial killers in the 1970s and 80s was somehow connected to the sort of military intelligence complex and maybe certain things that were going on during the Phoenix program, which of course Michael Aquino was involved in, but also, I think McGowan is kind of unique because he is a kind of quote-unquote conspiracy theorist or conspiracy writer who does write from a pretty left-wing, not with too fine of a point on it, but definitely from a kind of left-wing, anti-war perspective. And actually, as I was reading through this, somebody who I think he does have a certain amount in common with is Mark Lombardi. Even though their approaches to these kind of topics were different and kind of they basically, Mark Lombardi had trouble putting his kind of investigations into book form, and I feel like Dave McGowan took this other approach, which almost, it feels kind of like you're riding through a bunch of interlocks, like when you're reading this, except it's just sort of written out in prose, but it has the same kind of feeling.
I think there's two aspects of what you're saying. On one hand, like, it's an interesting comparison because, Mark Lombardi was an artist, but his work didn't really directly address art as, like, the art world. A lot of it had to do with sort of banking networks and that type of thing, whereas this book is, very much about, like, the interlocks between, like, the world of art and the production of cultural production, and intelligence and, those types of strange links. So it's they're interesting counterparts in a way. And, and I think that and on the other hand, they both do share that kind of style that, it's interesting. It's not really like, it's one that I guess maybe is excluded from the sort of criteria of, like, rigorous, like, journalism or academic work, I guess, that maybe is, associated with, it's like the sort of genre of, like, conspiracy writing. It's hard to pick, I guess, has a sort of associational or stream of consciousness type style or layout that has, like, sort of a frenetic structure to it. I mean, it's interesting. I think that there's, like, value in the perspective that's afforded by that stuff that, like, anybody can recognize, and that, like, stepping into these different, having those sort of different criteria and those different, standards of creating a connection between things is valuable. And, like, a lot of the time we sort of, lose that when, we use these more orthodox methodologies, I guess. And I think that's something that art allows, and also something that maybe the conspiratorial frame allows. That's like the sort of critical paranoia that some people have talked about, like Dali, maybe you could say.
Well, I mean, that's a term we've sort of embraced in our little blurb is the critical paranoid perspective, which I think and like Dave McGowan, I think he's, like, aware that he sounds paranoid, and he does say in the beginning that basically he caught a lot of flack from people who maybe enjoyed other parts of his work, because he acknowledges that the sort of subjects of his research in this book really hits on, like, a raw nerve with a lot of people, because it's talking about our beloved cultural or counter-cultural icons of the 1960s and the 1970s. And there's so much... It's an interesting thing that, as he goes into this, there's so much about this era that is not particularly well known even in like the mainstream rock lore. Like, people don't really know that much about it, but everyone feels like they know what went down, because there is a kind of broad narrative that of how the 60s counterculture sort of came into being. And I think with his approach in this, he, I'm trying to find the thing here where he states that people were the criticisms that he got. He says, when early installments of this story were posted online, I received a fair amount of negative feedback. Among other things, I was accused of inferring, quote, guilt by association, and of engaging in, quote, character assassination. One rather strident respondent complained that it was unfair to take a few isolated facts about an individual and use them to paint a sinister picture. To some extent, these are valid complaints, and yes, it is fairly easy to gather together a few different isolated facts and use them to paint a much different portrait of these artists and pen an impassioned defense of any of them. Jim Morrison and Frank Zappa seem to have the most rabid fans, by the way, in case anyone was wondering. But what I ask, but what I ask is that you try to stand back and take in the big picture and then ask yourself the following question. Exactly how many coincidences does it take to make a conspiracy? And yes, by the way, I'm very much aware of the fact that Jim Morrison was fond of telling interviewers that his parents were dead, and that, according to legend, he did so because they were, in essence, dead to him. But as one photograph reveals, Jim's dad wasn't dead to him just months before his emergence as a rock star. The photo, reproduced at the front of this book, shows the two Morrisons on the bridge of the USS Bonhomme Richard in January 1964. It seems rather obvious to me that telling people your parents are dead could be a very effective way of avoiding talking about who your father really is. It was such an effective strategy, in fact, that it took over 4 decades for the truth to finally come out. And so that is what opens the book, is this photograph, and I don't know, it is a picture of a young. I'm looking at it right now. It's a picture of a young, very clean cut, not rock and roll sex god looking Jim Morrison, who's probably, I don't know, at the time maybe like 18 or 19, and sitting next to him, looking out like the port window, maybe in the captain's quarters, is his father, U.S. Navy Admiral George Stephen Morrison. And see, that's the thing right off the bat. I've told this to people so many times over the last 5 years. Like, did you know that Jim Morrison's dad was a Navy admiral who was in command of the ships at the Gulf of Tonkin incident? And people were like, wait, what? No. You think that would be, even if you're going to have a traditional narrative, if he was truly kind of this rebel that he presented himself to be, like that, how could that not just fuel the rebel persona? The fact that his dad is he's works in the war machine. His dad is literally the man who played an instrumental role in starting the whole Vietnam War that Jim Morrison's generation and supposedly his music was rebelling against. So it's you can't have it both ways. If he said they're dead and he doesn't want to have anything to do with them, why not denounce them then or something? Or did he think that, you know what I mean? It's just a little bit. It's a little bit funny, and as we're about to see in this book, Dave McGowan just hits you again and again and again with bizarro coincidences, and I think what he says there is right. How many coincidences does it take to start basically looking more like a conspiracy than just a weird, and maybe some of these things I will say are genuinely coincidences. I think that's probably not only possible but likely. But as we get into this, just like with the Grateful Dead, it's all these people just ended up at the exact right place at the exact right time. John Perry Barlow's hanging out with Tim Leary, tries to be a suicide bomber. Augustus Housley Stanley checks himself into a notorious mental hospital, et cetera, and all these people have extreme blue blood political, military, economic connections. How much of that can you?
Owsley in this book is great, by the way. I mean, we touched on his susness in the Grateful Dead episode, but the section about him is very good. Yeah, there's just something about, maybe it's the name Owsley itself, something
Owsley.
About Owsley. No, that just that's the picture of a coincidence or a meaningless association, but something about Owsley, just I don't like it. It creeps me out. It rubs me the wrong way.
And even his nickname Bear is a little bit creepy. He's a little bear, he's a cuddly little bear, but actually a bear is dangerous.
I've been put off by those bears. I think that seeing those bears throughout my life, before even knowing the significance of them, I've just always been disturbed and just never cared much for those bears. They always they always made me uncomfortable a bit. So maybe that's part of it as well. But yes, I was a magical LSD peddler as well.
Yeah, just taught himself how to do it in 2 weeks at the Berkeley Library, and then just went for it. And
yes,
and actually. But maybe before we dive in, this actually isn't. McGowan probably didn't have an opportunity to discover this video, but we had brought up, I think, in part 2 of Warlocks of Palo Alto, episode 34, the videotaped reunion party in, I think, 1979 that Tim Leary hosted in LA that had like Al Hubbard and a lot of these old, and they're like, oh, like Dr. John Lilly's coming by later, you know, basically the one where they were talking about like they were reminiscing about how did this whole crazy LSD thing get started. And I think I'd read the quote, but I want to read it again because I knew we would come back to this, like something kind of interesting and cryptic that Timothy Leary said, I think at minute 34 in this reunion. And yeah, I have it right here. Leary said, as you go around the country, I'm sure you've all experienced, you talk to middle-aged, fairly respectable people in Tucson, Arizona, and they say, this is where it really happened, or in San Francisco, or the Lower East Side, and no one has ever really talked about what was going on in Los Angeles during those years. I think much more was done down here. There was a much wider range. There were more doctors involved. There were more scientists involved. It was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, if you want to call it. Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way, and it's never been as public as some of the other, you know, the buses running around the country. Of course, that's referring to the Merry Pranksters, yeah. And that whole gang up at Stanford and Ken Kesey. But you know, that always jumped out at me. Like our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool, and yet they did more in a very laid back way, and it's never been as public as some of the other stuff. So, you know, I think then when you go and read Weird Seeds Inside the Canyon, you see that I don't think he's talking out of his ass there, because it sounds like something was going on down in Laurel Canyon, Los Angeles, starting probably around 1965, around the exact same time that the acid tests were happening up in and around Stanford and San Francisco. You had, and people also, this is a thing that McGowan gets out of the way rather quickly, is that's another really foundational, like almost Mandela effect, like misremembering that a lot of people have about the 60s, is that psychedelic rock and like kind of this countercultural folk rock stuff like all came out of San Francisco. I mean, as we've seen with Grateful Dead, it technically came out of Palo Alto, but putting that aside, the idea that it was like Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, people like that basically popularized that kicked off this like psychedelic music kind of revolution in the late 60s. But as is like, I mean, even among like historians, like it's incontrovertible that no, it actually all started with a very tight-knit group of bands in Laurel Canyon, which for anybody who doesn't know is a kind of secluded community in the Hollywood Hills, in one of the many canyons that cuts through basically into the San Fernando Valley. So it's basically the mouth of Laurel Canyon. I like that McGowan always calls it the mouth, like it's some kind of gaping hole into this like hellscape. But it's basically right. It spills out right onto Sunset Boulevard and like West Hollywood, and then right down the street a little bit is the famed Sunset Strip, where you had like the Whiskey A Go Go, and then later the Roxy, the Viper Room, that is still there, like to the Rainbow Room, etc. That was where all of these 60s bands like kind of debuted and had their big blow up. And so everybody was basically all the bands and the scene, if you will, was all based in this like very secluded kind of like if you ever go up there, it's like, I mean, that's what kind of why famous people live up in the hills. Like the roads are really narrow. I mean, even today, you don't get like cell phone reception up at the top of Laurel Canyon. Like people have extenders in their homes, but like if you, I remember that when I drove Lyft years ago, whenever I would drop somebody off in Laurel Canyon, it would be like frustrating and spooky that your cell phone would die out once you got to, a certain point. And so it's like very isolated, and it was even more so in the mid 20th century. And it became just apropos of kind of nothing. It just became the place all these people flocked to starting in 1965 and 66. So you get names like Frank Zappa, the Byrds, Arthur Lee, the band Love. And then pretty soon, Neil Young, Stephen Stills, David Crosby, who was in the Byrds. And they basically, and John Phillips and the Mamas and the Papas, like all these people descend upon Laurel Canyon in like a 1 to 2 year span, and they all get record contracts, and they all start pumping out this new type of electric folk music. And, quickly after that, like Bob Dylan, plugs in at the Monterey Folk Festival, and I think that might have been in either late '65 or '66, kind of like right after the Byrds had their first debut single, which was a cover of Dylan's "Mr. Tambourine Man," and then of course like this electric revolution in music like just exploded, and then shortly thereafter, you had these bands in San Francisco that also kind of jumped in on it, and there was a lot of interaction, obviously, between the San Francisco scene and the Laurel Canyon scene, but it really did all start here in Los Angeles, which did not, as McGowan notes, like have a huge music industry per se prior to kind of the mid-'60s, and it certainly wasn't a hub of like folk music or rock and roll or anything like that. Like back then it was like Nashville, Memphis, Detroit, and New York were kind of like the biggest places. And, like Greenwich Village and a little bit also the Cambridge scene of the early 60s, which McGowan notes has like some of the exact same personalities involved in running it. And so, that's the jumping off point, right? And but as we see, and this music is coded to this day as being very countercultural, very, against the Vietnam War, against the uptight, stuffy values of the 50s. And, as you see, as McGowan goes through all these people, you realize that is really more of like, that's like a phantom. It's not really there, even though the vibe is there, if that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you listen to a lot of this music, it sounds like it represents that era of now people have long hair and they're wearing bright psychedelic colors and they just want to be groovy and they don't want to, like, live in your world, man, and, like, all that kind of stuff. But, like, when you look at the personalities of a lot of these people, like I think we talked about before recording, like Frank Zappa, Stephen Stills, David Crosby, these guys were all kind of like, they were much closer to like John Milius than they were to like any kind of left-wing artist.
Frank Zappa is a great example. I feel like he is really the archetypal example of that, especially as he comes through in this book as just like a complete like fascist maniac. Just frothing, open, like, ideologically dedicated fascist. Like, not really what people think of, maybe, when they think of Frank Zappa. I feel like the Beach Boys, maybe, as well, is another good example of what you're talking about, like, in terms of the dissonance between, like, the kind of appearance of the associations and, like, the music that is being performed, or maybe what people think about. I feel like, there's definitely two aspects of the Beach Boys, and they definitely play a big role in this book. Yeah. There's two, famously, like, there's two kind of sides to them, where one, they're, like, very down the middle, like, surf rock kind of thing, and then they have this sort of, like, bizarre psychedelic side, and obviously a very darker dimension to that than maybe even people realize, but, the dichotomy, I think, comes through.
People, yeah, for sure. Like, people are, because even they were kind of pre-political and I don't know, whatever this cultural revolution potentially this cultural revolution was, they were around before it. They're actually one of the only bands that predated, like, 1965 that were kind of a big part of this scene. Like, most of the people were just dropped out of nowhere, basically, and, started doing it. But then the Beach Boys were almost like, they were the ones who had made it and been big. But then they did have this, like, probably around 65, 66, when a lot of them started getting into LSD and, like, partying a lot. And they, obviously, they had a lot of money to kind of throw around. And they get really sucked into this story. And in a way, it's almost like the Beach Boys are one of these bands where I feel like the 60s cultural revolution it like happened to them, like they were subjected to basically this like rapid transformation, which I guess you could say like the Beatles and a lot of other people, you know, they all grew their hair out and started doing acid, you know, all around the same time basically. But in the Beach Boys, there's so many dark currents, from like Brian Wilson's kind of mental illness and then getting like sort of like psychologically enslaved by Eugene Landy, the manipulative therapist who like stole all his money, and then Dennis Wilson's fucking like his extensive friendship with Charles Manson and his interactions with the Manson family, and like their psychotic father, like who's extremely abusive. Like there's a lot of really, and then Mike Love, who is obsessed with transcendental meditation, and I guess has like his brother is like a former NBA player who is like Brian's bodyguard, but it almost sounds like a kind of like Brian Wilson abuse. Like Mike Love has his goons like control Brian Wilson, and I don't know. It's just like, and you know, they're cousins on top of that. So it's yeah, and they were all, and they all loved dating like teenage girls, and that some of this stuff really, McGowan's right. Some of this stuff stings because like I went through a big Beach Boys phase, I think, like in college, maybe a little bit kind of like my more recent Eagles phase. And you know, they're going to pop up in this, to some extent. But you know, I do think the Beach Boys are kind of like, I don't know if, you know, I could say, maybe the Beatles put out, I love saying X is better than the Beatles. I just love it. Like, it's one of my favorite trolls. But like, I mean, the Beatles probably put out more consistently kind of like good records and stuff than like the Beach Boys. But I do think the Beach Boys, I like them more, and they're like a more interesting band. And
yeah,
I mean, they
I
were
do
also
think the Beach Boys are better than the Beatles. I mean, there's like lots of like, you know, shitty Beach Boys songs. Like, I mean, like Surfin' USA, like I can take it or leave it, like I don't care. Like, I think Pet Sounds is good, you know?
Oh,
like,
yeah. Pet Sounds, and even a lot of the Smile stuff that eventually came out is like quite good. And some of their weird deep cuts, like including their the Charles Manson song they did, Never Learn Not to Love, is like kind of it's good. I mean, like it gives it that Beach Boys treatment. You could see how if something had gone a different way, like Charles Manson would have just been another gun-toting freak who became a celebrity in the late 60s. Like that's the other thing, is like the whole narrative around Manson also just starts to get eaten out from below as you start reading this book. And even if you've never read Chaos or anything like that, you realize that like my hatred for like Quentin Tarantino, just like the levels just kept increasing throughout watching this, because we talked about it in the previous ep, like how annoying his like fantastical like reimagination of the Manson murders was, and how in a way it's like, I don't know, somehow it's even worse than like not portraying the reality, because he was so uninterested in all of these other aspects. Like there's no Dennis Wilson in that movie, there's no Terry Melcher, there's none of this stuff. It's like, what, you didn't even portray remotely what like the Laurel Canyon scene was like back. It was just really like, look, crazy. Steve McQueen, like, oh, Mama Cass, like, you know, it was like so fucking dumb.
Amazing that like at this point in time, like where there's really so much there in terms of the Manson connection. Like, what was that quote that in this book, like Brian Wilson says about Charles Manson? I think it was Brian Wilson. I might have been Dennis Wilson, but it was one of the Wilson brothers, who said, like, you know, my friend Charlie, you know, the wizard. Oh wow, it's right here. Okay.
Yeah, it is Dennis. Yeah.
Dennis told him, sometimes the wizard frightens me. Charlie Manson, who is another friend of mine, says he is God and the devil. He sings, plays, and writes poetry. Like, he said, Charlie Manson, who is a friend of mine.
Like, no, for sure. I mean, Neil Young said afterwards that he said something like, he said he was like a living poet, and he was like really, I think he went over to Dennis Wilson's and like hung out with Charles Manson and thought he was really talented and tried to get Terry Melcher.
There's something about this mentality that some people have where they're just like so easily like persuaded, like this the poetic or like celestial inspiration of like these fucking people like Charles Manson. It's very bizarre, but yeah, he like auditioned for Neil Young too. That like so crazy. Like
and Terry Melcher, and as it says in the Chaos book, like Terry Melcher went back to Spawn Ranch like after the murders and was like on LSD, like on his knees, like begging Charles Manson for forgiveness, and like that got totally left out of the narrative. There's just so much, and of course, like the thing that I feel like it must be so it must be so still tight. Like, I would love to go on my own research dig to like find out more about it. But the big kind of elephant in the room with Laurel Canyon is that from World War II to at least the early 1970s, it was the home of Lookout Mountain Laboratory, or AKA Lookout Mountain Air Force Base, which was perched atop Laurel Canyon, I think on Wonderland Avenue. And it was a top secret military installation that had a extremely like complex like film production facility and like film studio. In fact, I think it was the largest like indoor film studio in the world for a time in the 50s and 60s. And basically it was active like all through this entire period. And I think from the little that we know about it, it basically, they did a lot of top secret sort of anything to do with like filming or processing of film. Like, for example, they processed the film results from nuclear weapons tests, like in, the Pacific Ocean or in Nevada, or maybe photography of experimental planes, things like that. Also, I remember, I want to say maybe it was Crypto Cuttlefish years ago who made some kind of comparison with, I guess what they were probably doing during Vietnam was attaching cameras to like bomber and fighter jets that were like doing napalm raids in North Vietnam, and doing a lot of photography of like the kinetic action of like blowing shit up. And I think they drew a parallel to like the kind of like shoving his crotch in your face like style of Jim Morrison, and basically like the kind of like sensory assault, and that there was some kind of maybe connection. I don't know. Like, McGowan doesn't go too deep into, because I guess he just doesn't know, because it's all still classified, what actually was being done there. But there were also internal kind of government educational films and things like that, and there were a number of actors, including, I believe, like Gene Kelly, Jimmy Stewart, Marilyn Monroe, who all went and like shot things at Lookout Mountain in like the 1950s, and we still have no idea what they were doing. And yeah, it's maybe not the biggest film studio ever, I see here, but yeah, by 1947 the facility had a fully operational movie studio that has been claimed to be the world's only completely self-contained movie studio. So everything from A to Z, from pre to post production and whatever, could be done there. It was 100,000 square feet, included sound stages, screening rooms, film processing labs, editing facilities, an animation department, and 17 climate-controlled film vaults. It also had a helicopter pad and a bomb shelter. Over its lifetime, the studio produced some 19,000 classified motion pictures, more than all the Hollywood studios combined. Officially, the facility was run by the U.S. Air Force and did nothing more nefarious than process AEC footage of atomic and nuclear bomb tests. The studio, however, was clearly equipped to do far more than just process film. There are indications that Lookout Mountain Laboratory had an advanced research and development department that was on the cutting edge of new film technologies. Such technological advances as 3D effects were apparently first developed at the Laurel Canyon site, and Hollywood luminaries like John Ford, Jimmy Stewart, Howard Hawks, Ronald Reagan, Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, Hedda Hopper, and Marilyn Monroe were given clearance to work at the facility on undisclosed projects. There's no indication that any of them ever spoke of their work at the clandestine studio. And the facility retained as many as 250 producers, directors, technicians, editors, animators, etc., both civilian and military, all with top security clearances, all reporting to work in a secluded corner of Laurel Canyon. Accounts vary as to when the facility ceased operations. Some claim it was in 1969, while others say the facility remained in operation longer. But in any event, by all accounts, the secret bunker had been up and running for more than 20 years before Laurel Canyon's rebellious teen years, and it remained operational for the most turbulent of those years. The existence of the facility remained unknown to the general public until the early 90s, though it had long been rumored that the CIA operated a secret movie studio somewhere in or near Hollywood. Filmmaker Peter Curran was the first to learn of its existence through classified documents he obtained while researching his 1995 documentary, Trinity and Beyond. And yet even today, nearly 20 years after its limited public disclosure, one would have trouble finding a single mention of the secret military intelligence facility anywhere in conspiracy literature. So, you know, I mean, like, what's going on there? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
is that where they shot the Bigfoot walking away from the camera footage?
It could have been.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of neglected foliage. You know, it's very
very peculiar. It reminds me a little bit of. I mean, Jack Parsons comes up in this book, but it reminds me a little bit of Marjorie Cameron's work for the Navy, like in photography. That,
absolutely, the Hollywood Navy. The Hollywood Navy. And of course, there are connections he draws out here. I believe he says that Dennis Hopper was a member of the Agape Lodge of the OTO. Mm-hmm. That, of course, was set up by Aleister Crowley, and that Jack Parsons and I think L. Ron Hubbard were both members of.
Yeah, the Agape Lodge. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then of course, like Augustus Owsley Stanley, when he moved to L.A. in the early '60s, I think in 1963, he worked for a while at JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which was co-founded by Parsons and had a bunch of Nazis working for it, very notoriously. And just after serving in the Air Force as an electronic warfare specialist.
It really does. It really does paint like a more, because, for instance, just to continue along the line of the comparison to S.K. Bain, which, maybe isn't the most salient or fully appropriate, but it is like, when all these sort of circumstantial things like constellate together, you really get, like, for instance, the whole argument of S.K. Bain is that there's this group of elites who have this satanic religion that they all practice, and that, the larger public isn't really privy to, but it's very intricate, and in his analysis, to truly understand what happened in 9/11, it's all bound up in the symbology of this religion. But you can almost, he doesn't even really argue for that so much as just stated as fact, and maybe the reading of 9/11 is meant to speak for itself. But in this, you really do get this bizarre sense of this sort of secret religious fraternity or something that all these people belong to, these same themes that they're all fascinated with for some reason, the compelling fascination with, I mean, the occult, magic, wizards, these things are very fascinating, but it's just interesting how all these people are so drawn powerfully into the world, the serious exploration of the occult and, demons and Satanism and exploring these themes, in their art, in such a, institutional way. It's, very strange.
No, it's very bizarre. And, there were real, I think, whereas it might be harder. S.K. Bain might have a harder time because he's dealing with kind of high political figures, but so he's not able to say, oh, well, this person is a member of the OTO. But with these kind of Hollywood freaks and these famous people and everything in Laurel Canyon, they're kind of, it's part of their shtick a little bit to be into this occulty kind of magic woo woo stuff, and so they're all kind of much more open about it. So you actually know a little more that some of them were flirting around with Satanism, and there's multiple references to that throughout this book with almost everybody involved on some level. I think there were
the picture that's portrayed, at least in this book, is that in this scene it was almost ubiquitous. I think that even Three Dog Night was practicing Satanism,
yes,
maybe
Three Dog Night, No, I think that somebody involved in Three Dog Night was, and there's a quote here. Chris Hillman, who's in The Birds, in one of many instances that McGowan notes, his house burned to the ground on what was described as, quote, a hot, witchy day in the 60s. According to Hillman, quote, Crosby was at my house an hour before the blaze. I can't connect it yet, where the Satan factor came into play with David, but I'm working on it. It's just like, okay, like the Satan factor with David Crosby, like what does that mean?
This is like a quote from Sammy Davis Jr. that he uses as like the epigraph for chapter 2. Everyone there had at one time or another been into Satanism, or like myself had dabbled around the edges for sexual kicks, referring to the victims at CeeLo Drive.
The Rat Pack was not on. I think like Peter Lawford was kind of like in this mix as well. At various times, and of course, like Sammy Davis Jr. was in the Church of Satan. There's that famous picture of him, Anton LaVey, and Michael Aquino, from back in maybe the early 70s. And that is true. Like they're basically all of the victims were kind of involved in some trippy shit. In fact, I remember from the Chaos book that O'Neill wrote that one of the earliest kind of slogans being banned, like one of the original kind of rumors after the Tate murders, was that these people had been involved in something, and the quote, I think maybe published in a newspaper, was "live freaky, die freaky." So people were saying like, yeah, well, these people were getting into some dark shit. What do they expect would happen? Which I think in a way is like kind of true. It's just it's a question of how freaky really was it, and I think McGowan makes a pretty good case that like it was. Yeah, and just, he lists out all the deaths of people, and I think some of them, a lot of car crashes, overdoses, etc. Not to say every single person who died was like bumped off, but there are a lot of weird deaths and it's like a high casualty rate. Given that all of these people mostly were military-age young men that down to a T avoided the draft at the height of the Vietnam War when they were supposedly making millions of dollars making songs against the Vietnam War. I think that's a great point that McGowan makes, is if you want to kind of point out maybe some evidence for susness, it's like how easy would it have been for the U.S. government to just get these people off the airwaves and send them to Nam, like if it really wanted to. I mean, yes. Like if they were actually dangerous, like why wouldn't and maybe that's a kind of thing that's a psyop in and of itself, that like look how free America is. You can even make money being an anti-war like folk rock guy. Yes. And the government might like complain about you, but it won't touch the teensiest hair on your head, or send you to Vietnam like it's doing to like millions of other young men. And so in a way, like if you accept the premise of that, it kind of implies that like the U.S. government is less, authoritarian or evil or whatever than it actually is. When in fact they could have just like, these guys were maybe had a role to play, and so we're gonna leave them alone. But of course, if they stepped out of line and went in a direction maybe that the government really didn't like, I'm sure something could have happened to them. And also a lot of them ended up dead at like 27. So, maybe some of them were knocked off eventually after, their usefulness was done. Or, maybe as even some people, I think, suspected Jim Morrison faked their own death and like lived, under like kind of witness protection. Identity. I don't know about that per se, but just there's a lot of weirdness.
Mr. America, walk on by your schools that do not teach. Mr. America, walk on by the minds that won't be reached. Mr. America, try to hide the emptiness that's you inside. But once you find that the way you lied and all the corny tricks you tried will not forestall the rising tide of hungry freaks, Daddy. They won't go for no more great Midwestern hardware store philosophy that turns away from those who aren't afraid to say what's on their minds. The left behinds of the great society.
So I don't know. Do we want to start with maybe a couple? Do we want to maybe like get into maybe Frank Zappa as like a start? Because we can discuss. He more than anybody, maybe Frank Zappa and also Vito Paulekas, who I think we had mentioned maybe back in the Kenneth Anger episode. Or I think maybe I had some notes on him for the Grateful Dead episode, but like Frank Zappa and Vito Paulekas are really, I think McGowan makes a pretty good case that they're the actual inventors of the hippie aesthetic and like the hippie style, which was more called the freak style in their parlance, right, in the early 60s. And you know, I think everybody knows, like, I mean, who Frank Zappa was, but just to, let's see, maybe we'll talk about, well, like, Vito Paulekas was, he was like he owned like a sculpting studio or something, like an art studio in West Hollywood, like near the Sunset Strip. And he was an older guy, and I guess everyone says that he made his money like teaching like wealthy Beverly Hills housewives, you know, dowagers or whatever. And people kind of liked it because he would use nude models and stuff in like his art classes. So like teenagers and stuff would want to go and stuff like that. And he had this gaggle of young women, and I guess was very into doing a lot of LSD and having orgies and stuff like that. And he became kind of like this fixture on the Sunset Strip. And actually, a lot of people credit him with basically filling the clubs like the Whiskey A Go-Go. Like when bands like the Byrds or the Doors or Frank Zappa first came to play, because he would show up with like kind of like this band of like merry pranksters, but they were all like hot young groupies, and they would all be like, I don't know, maybe on acid or something, but they would just be dancing like, you know, like the classic 60s like wild psychedelic kind of dance style. And they were such a sight to see that, and the venues apparently would let them in for free. And then like people said, you know, that would basically be kind of the main draw. Like you wouldn't even hear, I think, some people in the Byrds said, like, I don't even think people were like listening to us. They were just like vibing off of these dancers and things like that. Which is relevant because a lot of these bands, McGowan also illustrates that, you know, and this might sting a little bit, but like they weren't really good musicians, or in some cases musicians at all. Like, and that's another strong takeaway, really powerful takeaway from this book, is that we, in our popular imagination, there was a line. I think the great example that he uses is there's a line between bands like the Monkees and bands like Buffalo Springfield or Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young or the Byrds. Right. And like one was like corporate, manufactured, like a quote unquote fake band. Like I remember this my whole life. Yes. Like they used to play the Monkees on like Nick at Night, and you'd watch them and it was like, oh, but they were like a fake band, not like the Beatles or like one of these other bands. Like they're, right, but then McGowan lays out that like, well, actually, first of all, like, I mean, the Monkees were actually real musicians as well. They were actually kind of no different from like Stephen Stills or David Crosby. And in fact, several of the very important, you know, respectable artists of Laurel Canyon, like Stephen Stills, auditioned to be in the Monkees. And they didn't get in.
Yes.
So
I found that part of the book actually to be very interesting, because he does kind of explore this sort of like illusory distinction between the Monkees. And I think the Beach Boys is one that you know, comes up a fair, you know, like, because I think that he actually says when he talks about the Beach Boys, some readers might be inclined to dismiss the Beach Boys as being roughly on par with that other much maligned Laurel Canyon band, the Monkees. So that to me was odd, because I feel like maybe before this book was written, maybe like or maybe like in his circles, because I feel like the Beach Boys have, maybe it's from talking to you, but I feel like they have more credibility, you know, than the Monkees. But there is that kind of like break in their career where, or like, you know, their sort of oeuvre where like, some of their stuff definitely could be like in the area of like, thank you, Gil, like type, like, like shit, like,
yeah.
But,
well, no,
like,
I think a lot of people, I remember, like, when I got into, I had a friend of mine, or a couple of friends of mine who got, like, really into, like, the Beach Boys and, like, their kind of mythology and, like, Pet Sounds and stuff, and so I had kind of had that little bias against the Beach Boys before that, when I was younger. Like, I mean, like, yeah, sure, California Girls is, like, a good song or whatever, but I always kind of thought, like, going down surfing and having some fun was, like, just, like, so lame. And, like,
just, like, literally, like,
corny.
even as a child, I was like, this is corny as hell, like, get me away from this. And, like, if someone said, like, the Beach Boys, like, whereas...
And
like,
their name. Their name sounds goofy.
Sure. Yeah, and the sort of melancholic, like, you wouldn't imagine, like, the melancholic quality of, like, the songs on Pet Sounds, like, that, I know there's an answer or something, like, about, like, trying to deal with, like, all these people on drugs, or, like, you wouldn't really make, and, like, I think that some people still
I just wasn't made for these times.
Yeah, exactly, but it speaks to kind of the sort of illusion of the difference between a band like that and the Monkees, because, like, some people actually do perceive the Beach Boys as being kind of like the Monkees, when...
In that sense,
like,
but also, I think...
And in a way, they originally were, kind of very much like the Monkees, and you can kind of see, like...
Well, that's the real revelation, is that a lot of these bands were just like the Monkees. Like, in fact, almost except for the one critical thing, whereas the Monkees were like an exoteric, hey, we're putting together a band, it kind of reminds me of boy band stuff in, like, the late 90s, early 2000s, which I think is another thing that people will go, whoa, what, like, stop what you're saying. Like, this is, people would get triggered if you started to say that what's really the difference between, like, pedo billionaire con man Lou Pearlman getting Max Martin to produce the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, pretty much based on image, and, like, they were just singers and, like, dancers or whatever. They didn't have any musical skills per se. And, like, what's the difference between that and, like, Buffalo Springfield? People want to fight me over that, Like, how dare you? Like, that was real music. But then when you look at it, it's like, well, actually, like, no, in most cases, a lot of these bands, they were singers who didn't really have, like, virtuosic musical backgrounds at all. And as we see again and again, that, like, this wasn't acknowledged at the time. It's somewhat better known today, but so many, I would almost argue the majority of the hit singles and the big records that came out of Laurel Canyon specifically were actually the product of a group of session musicians who were called informally the Wrecking Crew, who worked for producer Phil Spector, who eventually became, like, a crazy murderer. Right? Like, he killed somebody eventually. But he was, like, the hard-charging, kind of crazy, almost like the Don Draper of, like, 60s record producers who did some kind of Motown stuff and then moved into producing a lot of these LA bands. So, like, even on Pet Sounds, that is the Wrecking Crew playing the music. And that's actually, that's one case where it's well known because the compositions were so complex. And, to Brian Wilson's credit, like, he did write and compose the Beach Boys music. So it wasn't fully like the Monkees, where I actually don't know if the Monkees wrote any of their own material. They were capable of doing it. They were no less capable than, like, David Crosby at writing their own material. And, if you look at the Byrds, their first album is almost all covers. Like, most of their records, even the Graham Parsons era, they went through a bunch of different lineups, but the vast majority of Byrd songs are basically covers of folk songs set to, like, electric music, electric instrumentation. So, then if you just go down the line, like the Mamas and the Papas, California Dreamin', Monday, all of Pet Sounds, most of the Byrds' early music, with the exception of Roger McGuinn's 12-string guitar, was all the Wrecking Crew. It was all one band of, like, incredibly talented, like, jazz musicians, mostly, who were brought in. And, that's really where, like, the sound... I mean, that shit is actually good, I think we can say that, like, the musicianship on those records and the production quality, Phil Spector's wall of sounds and stuff, like, that was actually kind of innovative and stuff. But it really undermines so many myths about like American arts and culture, that all of these people were kind of like the faces that were put on the same band, just playing songs for everybody and like not being credited for it. So, you know, I mean, when I was a teenager listening to the 60s music, I just assumed that everybody on the cover of the album were the people playing the instruments. But in many cases, like David Crosby, like could not play guitar very well. The first bassist they had was a very good mandolin player, but like he'd never played the bass before. And then the drummer like also was like a beatnik who had like, you know, played bongo drums before, but he wasn't like a drummer. So like they just like swapped out all those people with the Wrecking Crew, and that's why the record sounds good. But when they would go to, and this brings back to Vito, when they would go out to play at the Whiskey A Go-Go, they sucked. Like they couldn't play live music well. And that's the thing about the Beach Boys that is said as well, is that they were not a particularly good live band. And, you know, it kind of took them years to like, you know, I mean, Dennis Wilson was the drummer. He was notorious for like not being a very good drummer and stuff like that. But, you know, when they would all go on these shows, McGowan does point this out, that, you know, these super real artists would always basically lip sync their songs. And it's very obvious when you go watch like American Bandstand or the Ed Sullivan Show. For the most part, I think maybe like the Rolling Stones played live or something, and that's what I forget what they said. Like they said a lyric, they weren't "Let's spend the night together," and they got banned, which is probably an op just to like establish their street cred or something. But you know, but all these people were playing like even like Neil Young, who like I've seen live before. I think Neil Young is like very talented, but actually according to McGowan, they had to add Neil Young to Crosby, Stills, and Nash because none of them were like good enough live performers to actually like go on tour and like have a successful big. And Neil Young at least was a pretty like entertaining, spirited, you know, live performer and guitarist and singer. So they had to throw that Y in there to like, you know, push him. And then they got, I think, you know, a couple like session musicians basically to back him up on bass and drums, you know, and then probably turn Crosby's amp down and like let him pretend to play guitar, you know, but so that
me a little bit of that like Kenneth Anger remark about the Jonas Brothers and how like, you know, he appreciated the Jonas Brothers and they're sort of like that Disney like 3D or whatever, and he saw them as kind of like an ancient tradition of like reverence for one's idols and suffering for, you know, the girls who would line up to see the Jonas Brothers movie like suffering for their idols. That's something that is very much like the Monkees, like in a way. I mean, Kenneth Anger comes up in this book a lot. Like
that is well. I mean, that's also that's you know, like, dude. That's also the groupie culture in general. Is that's what it, like suffering for your idols, and so that actually brings us right back to Vito Paulekas, because he had this like army of like freak groupies who kind of were the first manifestation of that, even before kind of Beatlemania. But then really in like 1965, so basically he would start going, you know, with these people to like dance and freak out and stuff, and that would, and then he was also just like the Byrds actually started out playing, I think, in like his studio, like his art studio, like he would use them. He would let them use it, you know, to practice and stuff. And then he would go to all the early Byrds gigs, and with all these beautiful young women. And I guess he was also a little bit of a pimp, you know. Mm-hmm. And he was right in the heart of it. And and then became very close with Frank Zappa. And I think there was let me see. Also, just to throw out, just like how, because these connections, we'll probably just add them as they go. It's worth noting that let's see. Oh yeah, on page 68, Vito Paulekas, like his first cousin, married Winthrop Rockefeller in 1948 and became Bobo Rockefeller. But Vito's family apparently was not invited to the nuptials because like British royalty and like all these people were there, and they were a kind of poor immigrant family. They were Lithuanian, I think, and you know, he grew up somewhere in Pennsylvania. the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were both there, and the Marquess of Blandford. And then he moved to L.A. in 1949, and I guess he was like a clay sculptor, artist. And he did go to jail for a while for an armed robbery when he was young. And he married, in 1961, he married Sue, I think, but it's spelled S-Z-O-U, who is previously known as Susan Cynthia Schaefer. He was 48 at the time, and she was 18. She'd only been 16 when they met. And they made their home in a building on the corner of Laurel Avenue and Beverly Boulevard, just below the mouth of Laurel Canyon, and practically within spitting distance of Manson victim J. Sebring's hair salon. At street level was Sue's clothing boutique, which has been credited by some scenesters with being the very first to introduce hippie fashions. Upstairs were living quarters for Vito, Sue, and their firstborn son, Godo, which we'll get to him in a minute. Paulekas made a living of sorts by giving clay modeling lessons to Beverly Hills matrons who found the atmosphere in his studio exciting. According to most accounts, it wasn't really the Mayan tomb decor of the studio, it kind of goes to like Dr. Hodor that we'll get to later, that many of the matrons found so exciting, but rather Vito's reportedly insatiable sexual appetite and John Holmesian physique. In any event, Vito's students apparently included such Hollywood luminaries as Jonathan Winters, Mickey Rooney, and Steve Allen. And so he had a sidekick named Carl Franzoni, who has claimed in interviews that his, quote, mother was a countess and his father was a stone carver, Mason, from Rutland, Vermont. The family was brought from Italy, from the quarries in the northern part of Italy, to cut the stone for the monuments of the United States. That would make his ancestors, it stands to reason, of considerable importance in the Masonic community. And there were, in fact, a couple brothers named Franzoni who were brought over from Italy in the early 1800s to carve the Masonic monuments of Washington. So, they made all his... this guy is the ancestor of the Italian Masons who built all the Masonic things. So he it sounded like he might have some kind of like mafia kind of connections. And also, I just wanted to point out here, because this name, somebody else pointed this out years ago on Twitter, but one of the other main guys in his crew was a bizarre character named Ricky Applebaum, who had a mustache on one side of his face and a half a beard in the other. And then a bunch of girls who would later become part of Frank Zappa's GTO project, like a groupie band he set up, and a lot of other colorful characters who donned pseudonyms like Linda Bop, Butchie, Beetle Bob, Emerald, and Karen Yum Yum. But just to go back for a second to Ricky Applebaum, wouldn't you know that Ricky Applebaum is the father of the based Tor warrior, internet freedom hacker dude, Jacob Applebaum, who, like, some of you might remember if you've been on like paranoid Twitter long enough, then or just like Hacker Anonymous, like kind of adjacent Twitter. He is the kind of celebrity hacker dude who helped develop, he was a core member of the Tor project and was like a huge advocate, and was also a representative of WikiLeaks. He also did a bunch of art, collaborated with Ai Weiwei and Laura Poitras of Snowden fame, and he used to tweet under IO Error, but I think he was an active member of the Cult of the Dead Cow hacker collective that Beto O'Rourke was in. And was also he worked for Kink.com and Greenpeace. Cool.
Oh my fucking god.
And also volunteered for the Ruckus Society and the Rainforest Action Network. But then, of course, he was kicked out of Tor in 2016 following allegations of sexual abuse. But then a bunch of people were like, he's being like oppressed because he loves WikiLeaks, like free Julian, blah, blah, blah. And he lives in Germany, fittingly enough. Applebaum was among several people to gain access to former NSA contractor Edward Snowden's top secret documents in 2013. Wow. Oh, I definitely trust him.
Everyone, sign up for Signal.
Sign up for Signal.
Snowden uses it. He's not dead yet. Therefore, that's,
he's not dead. He certainly hasn't been MK'd. He hasn't gotten the Vacaville treatment. Not any chance of that. So this guy, he traveled to in 2005 he talked at the 22nd Chaos Communication Congress, where he talked about his travels to Iraq, crossing the border by foot, for installing the internet satellites in Kurdistan, and his visits to New Orleans post Hurricane Katrina.
The ones that I bet you could use those internet satellites with an iPad to call in a drone strike.
Wow, based ally. Wow. Okay, Comrade Jacob Applebaum. So this guy is kind of canceled now, but like I knew he was sus basically for years, even beyond his like weird sexual harassment things, but just because he felt like a total like fake hacker spook person. And then wouldn't you know it, his dad was running around with the inventor of freak culture, who also had a lot of problematic sexual behaviors or ideas about particularly adolescent sexuality and things like that. And Vito Paulekas, he was also I believe he was present. He was kind of present at all kinds of things, including I think at the famous Altamont Free concert that we talked about in the Kenneth Anger episode, which McGowan does do some good stuff on, because like a lot of these characters, like a lot of it converges basically on Altamont. You had Graham Parsons and the Flying Burrito Brothers playing there, and of course the Kenneth Anger connections. Well, maybe let's talk about that real quick, because the son of Vito Paulekas, what was his name? Godot, yeah. Starting the tradition.
I don't know if the cadence was like Godot like Vito, or Godot like waiting for Godot, but yes, he was cast to play Lucifer originally in Lucifer Rising. Yes,
he was.
Yes, but what happened was that he died.
And he was also very bizarrely, he was like photographed and featured in Life magazine in 1966, I guess, where they did a story on Vito Paulekas and his groovy wife. And that's another thing that pops up again, is like Time and Life. And I believe I forget which one was run by Henry Luce, who was like Skull and Bones and Knew the Bushes and all that jazz. But they were there at every step of the way to be like, look at this interesting new psychedelic thing that people are doing. And, going back to, I think, Gordon Wasson's article about magic mushrooms in 1957. And then here they are, like in 1966, being like, look at this guy, Vito. Oh, it's so interesting. And I guess, I don't know how Kenneth Anger came, he definitely knew these people. And
I've heard some really Kenneth Anger, we've talked about him and his sort of interest in, obviously in sensuality and, these and the young men. I mean, I don't know if at least his movies don't show like necessarily an erotic gaze towards very young children, but I definitely have heard certain things about. I don't recall if they're mentioned in this book, but I do recall maybe while we were researching for the Kenneth Anger episode that I do recall hearing certain things about the treatment of Godot in the Laurel Canyon community. There is a mention of this Renaissance Fair group that I guess was Ron Patterson's thing.
That's another thing.
Burning Man.
I had no idea that the Renaissance fairs were sus. I always maybe felt they were kind of sus, but I had no idea they were connected in this way.
Yeah,
like they were a San Francisco new agey thing.
Right, and there were sort of improvisational theater workshops involved there for children. That was part of the Renaissance Fair thing, and McGowan wonders if maybe Vito Paulekas had been involved in that. And he said, as any event, there is something decidedly creepy about children's workshops being hosted in a small, tight-knit community that was home to child pornography ring and more than its fair share of pedophiles. I definitely have heard, accounts of Laurel Canyon parties involving Vito Paulekas in, a way that...
I just want to...
Not good.
Not good. I just want to read a little of what some other people that McGowan relays, what they said about the strange death of Vito Paulekas. And McGowan wrote, According to Barry Miles, Vito and Sue's 3-year-old son Godo had fallen through a trapdoor on the roof of the building and died. Let's see. Yeah,
Wow.
Michael Walker tells of there's a lot of trapdoors in these houses too. Michael Walker tells of a 2 or 3 year old Godo falling to his death from a scaffold at the studio. An article in the San Francisco Weekly had it as a, quote, 5-year-old boy who died when he fell through a skylight. Super groupie and former freak dancer Pamela DeBar agreed with the skylight scenario, but not the age. And she said, this is a very creepy quote, Vito's exquisite little puppet child, Godot, fell through a skylight during a wacky photo session on the roof and died at age 3.5. Albin Pfisterer of the band Love recalled a much darker scenario, quote, Vito got married, had a baby, gave it acid, and it fell off the roof and died.
There's a warning on this, but they did actually mention a story which I guess I had heard earlier. It did come up here where he says it would be perhaps instructive to examine the context in which this tragedy played out. We know, for example, that a musician and writer named Raphael told writer Michael Walker that he had been present one evening at Vito's place when Godo was brought out. They say that they passed him around, with their mouths in a way that was supposed to be introducing him to sensuality.
He was naked, yes.
They passed him around naked in a circle with their mouths is what is said. Sorry, just like so upsetting.
It's disgusting.
Sorry, we need to recover for a bit, but there's another anecdote, the equally disturbing anecdote almost, following that, where after, the child had died, Des Barris says,
Pamela,
I was beside myself with sorrow, but Vito and Zoo insisted on continuing our plans for the evening. We went out dancing, and when people asked where little Godot was, Vito said, he died today. It was really, really weird.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then, and then from there, McGowan says, adding to the weirdness factor is the full text of the quote from the San Francisco Weekly that I previously presented an edited version of. Quote, Kenneth Anger's first candidate to play Lucifer, a 5-year-old boy whose hippie parents had been fixtures in the Los Angeles counterculture scene, fell through a skylight to his death. Like a fallen angel? By 1967, Anger had relocated to San Francisco and was searching for a new Lucifer. As some readers may be aware, he soon found his new Lucifer in the form of Mansonite and former grassroots guitarist Bobby Beausoleil.
I like that says, as some readers may be aware, people and from the Kenneth Anger
definitely.
And
Beausoleil, just in the same passage, Beausoleil has said that some of Anger's film projects were for private collectors. Quote, every once in a while he'd do a little thing that wouldn't be for distribution. Biographer Bill Landis has written that projects such as those led at one time to Anger being investigated by the police on suspicion that he had been producing snuff films.
Yes, we mentioned this in the Kenneth Anger episode. I mean, and he acknowledges that he does make a lot of things on commission, like both things that he releases and things that are private, for the Gettys, for instance. For John Paul Getty Jr., he was retained by him to make films. So,
and I there was another mention that I wasn't aware of yet that I want to say, was it Abigail Folger that was also financing Kenneth Anger? She was one of the Manson victims, and she was a Folger heiress. But it might have been her.
Right.
I had to look through. It was. On page 209, it was at It was at Mama Cass's home that Charlie Manson first met her neighbor, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, who helped finance Kenneth Anger's films, like the one that was supposed to star Vito Paulekas, but instead starred Bobby Beausoleil. So, that's weird. That's also not well known that Charlie Manson met Abigail Folger before the murders at Mama Cass's home. Another, great missed opportunity, Tarantino. You fucking hack.
Yeah.
I don't know. Come on. Just to throw in one more little Kenneth Anger thing. We'll get back to him later, but not long before the murder of John Lennon, assassin Mark David Chapman had approached cult filmmaker Kenneth Anger and offered him a gift of live bullets. Just days after Lennon was felled, Anger's long-delayed final cut of Lucifer Rising made its New York debut, very near the bloodstained grounds of the Dakota Apartments, which of course was the setting of Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby, etc. So Anger is just floating. Like, I did not know that Abigail Folger was funding Anger before her death. That's kind of, again, you'd think that would be, you know, more relevant, but I guess they, you know,
it's all in the family, not important. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, who cares?
You know,
and
it just happens.
So
normal.
I think, and so moving on, the final thing I'll say about Vito for now is that some people have compared Vito Paulekas to a later person who was very similar, which was Charles Manson. And McGowan talked to a member of the Paulekas family for the book, and he said he would let them provide the final words on the King of the Freaks. Asked by the author if he believed that Vito was a possible pedophile, he answered, quote, "Probably, but I believe you have to go deeper into the libido and drives of so many rock stars and famous people who had an unhealthy relationship with sex and drugs. Any biography of the rockers of that time, and probably any time, just skirts around the reality that their greatest secret and shame includes the sex they had and have with very young girls and boys. Roman Polanski just got caught." So, yeah.
That makes sense.
I don't do publicity balling for you anymore.
The first word in this song is discorporate. It means to leave your body.
Discorporate and come with me. Shifting, drifting, cloudless, starless, velvet valleys, and the sapphire sea. Wah wah, unbind your mind. There is no time to lick your stamps and paste them in. Discorporate, and we will begin. Wah wah,
flower power sucks.
Diamonds on velvets, on golden, on comet, on Cupid, on honor and Blitzen, on up and away and afar and a go-go. Escape from the way of your corporate logo. Unbind your mind, there is no time. Wine, you lick your stamps and paste them in. Discorporate, and we'll begin. Freedom, freedom, kindly loving, you'll be absolutely free. Only if you want to be. Tuning on cushions of velvet and satin to music by magic by people that happen to enter the world of a strange purple jello. The dreams as they live them are all mellow yellow. Unbind your mind, there is no time. Wine, you lick your stamps and paste them in.
Yeah, it definitely does. Because, you know, this guy was super tight with Frank Zappa, Mr. Cool, freedom, badass, like, just, you know, it's like,
I love that
cool.
quote from Frank Zappa about when, like, Václav Havel invited him, like, as an ambassador, like a cultural ambassador to Czechoslovakia or something. And he was like, I was so excited to go there just to watch communism fall or whatever. Like,
no, watch communism. He said he came here to, I came here to watch communism die. And then said,
like, I'm a capitalist.
This is in 1990, he visited Czechoslovakia at the request of newly installed President Václav Havel, who asked him to serve as a consultant on trade and tourism. Zappa was treated by the new Czech administration, which wasn't as nearly as popular at home as it was in the West. See, that's why I love McGowan. He doesn't fall for the anti-communist bullshit. As though he was making an official state visit. He announced that he had, quote, come to Czechoslovakia to see communism die. I've been an enthusiastic capitalist for years. He also announced his intention of starting up an international consulting firm aimed at breaking down barriers to Western trade and investment. Toward that end, he began meeting with multinational corporate entities that had an interest in investing in Czechoslovakia. And
there are so many insane Frank Zappa stories. Like, I just dug up this one, which I think is around the same place in the book. He, in the spring of 1967, signed a contract to play at the Garrick Theater in New York, an engagement that would last 6 months. On one notable occasion, Zappa invited active duty Marines onto the stage and handed them a doll, which he wanted them to pretend was a certain slur involving, starting with G and ending with K, baby. Yep. The GIs happily obliged the request and gleefully dismembered the doll while Frank looked on. Though Marines weren't normally a part of the show, concerts by the mothers often included the hurling of several baby doll heads into the crowd of gaping groovers. Awesome, radical. Really
that's
cool. Literally like the exact opposite of like groovy.
He should have called his. He should. I guess
Marines
that's why
on stage to like tear a baby apart or like a surrogate baby apart, like limb from limb. Yeah.
I guess that's why people, make bands and call themselves War Crime. Ironically, nowadays they're just doing a Zappa thing,
Exactly.
And I bet I bet you if you talked to like a Zappa stan, that they would be like, "Oh no, man! See, he was actually being ironic and like mocking I don't even know if they could pull that off, but I feel like some people would try that. Like he was mocking militarism, man, and like he was just being like absurdist, man. Like come on, But if you look pretty consistently at his opinions over his entire life, and even the message in a lot of his music, and the way people who knew him described him, he was kind of like John Milius. Like he was a gun-toting right-wing control freak who like hated communism and loved capitalism and was like kind of just like a libertarian basically, but because he talked shit to
he was just like a super jingoistic fascist, like openly, like he didn't really like try to hide it and was like proud of it, which is interesting, considering
it is
like
interesting.
That's not really part of his public or the way people think maybe about Frank Zappa or something that they readily associate with him, because like he definitely was like he was all about it.
People think
proudly.
that he's like kind of a libertarian leftist practically, but that is there's really nothing about it. It really is kind of fascist, but he dresses up in this goofy thing and he makes this like boopity bop boop bop I'm the slime man like goofy carnivalesque prog music, so how could he be a straight square conservative? This is where it starts to be like judging people by like the styles you're wearing or how long your haircut is. You start to see like politics really becoming more aestheticized, and like you could have like right-wing hippies like in the Grateful Dead or Frank Zappa, but as long as they have long hair, they somehow code as like left-wing rebels to like the status quo. It's very even if they are like relatively open about their kind of right-wing politics and stuff, but it's
and it just makes it all the more like odd where I think, as you mentioned, like his dad was like designing like ICBMs or like developing chemical warheads
maybe we should go into that because Frank Zappa didn't just come out of nowhere. He was born, as McGowan relates many times, like so many of these people, was born into a career military family. And his dad, basically, Frank spent a lot of his early childhood at the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, which was the hub of U.S. chemical warfare research, as well as being, by the government's own admission, the site of human mind control experimentation in the post-World War II years. So his first schooling was at the Edgewood School, which is, on the Edgewood Arsenal complex where his father worked and the family lived. At some point in the 1940s, the Zappa clan relocated to Florida for a short time for unknown reasons, but they soon returned to Baltimore and the Edgewood Arsenal. In 1951, Father Francesco was offered a permission at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, but he chose instead to head further west and relocate the family to absolute spook hub Monterey, California. While there, he taught classes at the Naval Postgraduate School. After a couple years in Monterey, the Zappas relocated once again, first briefly to Claremont before moving on to the San Diego area, the current home of of the world's largest naval fleet. While there, Francesco put his skills to work on the Atlas Missile Project, a program that would produce America's very first ICBMs. Zappa's area of expertise would tend to indicate that the U.S. was looking into developing chemical warheads for those ICBMs. That, though, is impossible to determine since Zappa's work in San Diego and elsewhere is classified. In the summer of '56, the Zappa family hit the road once again, this time landing in Lancaster, California, right alongside Edwards Air Force Base. That's just north of LA. Frank Zappa wouldn't be the only rising star to later arrive in Laurel Canyon by way of the sparsely populated wasteland of Lancaster. Joining him would be tragically short-lived Bird Clarence White, America vocalist Dewey Bunnell, and the indescribably bizarre Don Vliet, better known as Captain Beefheart. And then in March of 1963, Zappa famously appeared on the Steve Allen Show to, quote, play a bicycle as a musical instrument.
Yeah,
Crazy.
I remember that part. So ridiculous.
Yeah, and that same year, Herb Cohen, who has a super sus, mercenary background, who would become the manager of Frank Zappa, and fellow Canyonites Linda Ronstadt, Alice Cooper, Lenny Bruce, and Tim Buckley, returned to Los Angeles. After conveniently being in the Congo at the time of the CIA-sponsored coup that toppled and led directly to the execution of Patrice Lumumba, the country's first legally elected prime minister, Cohen had spent time in Copenhagen, Denmark, where he functioned as an international arms dealer. Then he got his residency in New York, where he had the Marines, rip apart a fake baby who he said was Vietnamese. And then I guess they developed a habit, the Mothers of Invention, his band, hurling severed baby doll heads into the crowd of gaping groovers, as Pamela DeBar remembers it. And then on the autumnal equinox of 1967, Zappa married Navy brat Adelaide Gale Sloatman, who was then working as a former cop gangster Elmer Valentine's personal assistant, overseeing the operations of the Whiskey A Go-Go and the Trip. Just 1 week later, daughter Moon Unit Zappa was born. She would ultimately be joined by 3 siblings, each bearing a progressively more bizarre name: Dweezil Zappa, Ahmet and Muka Rodon Zappa, and Diva Thin Muffin Pigeen Zappa. All would be pulled out of school at the age of 15, and their father would refuse to pay for any of them to attend college. And so he eventually moved into this house called the Log Cabin, which was right at the main intersection on Laurel Canyon Boulevard and I think Lookout Mountain Avenue, where there's the famous Laurel Canyon Country Store and a couple little businesses. So he lived in this palatial log cabin kind of compound and would let people kind of live in it all the time. I don't know, just hippies, drifters, groupies, all this kind of stuff. There's a strong overlap with the kind of Vito Paulekas kind of group, and they would dance at Frank Zappa's shows. Yeah, and I mean Zappa. I don't know, that background, of course, is very interesting because Zappa, and a lot of people don't, I think, realize this, Zappa never really took psychedelics or LSD.
Right, yeah. And that he points that out as being or McGowan points that out as being a consistency among people like Vito Paulekas and Frank Zappa and Charles Manson, that they surround themselves with people who take drugs very liberally, but they themselves either don't abstain or they limit their intake.
Yes. Yeah.
As
and that was
tactic.
Yeah, that was something Manson definitely did. Vito did. Even though there was a rare video that was found that was an interview, I think, with Sue and Vito Paulekas in the 60s. I think I linked it on the Grateful Dead episode, but there's one where they're kind of saying that it's bad. They're speaking negatively, I think maybe in the late 60s, early 70s, about LSD. There's a quote here. Where his wife says, you shouldn't do LSD. I tell all my friends, it's a military plot. And so, so on the one hand, you're telling everybody it's a military plot, but then there are all these accounts of people where, you're taking it yourself. You're also, giving it out to these, teenage girls that have kind of coalesced around you, and you're definitely kind of serving as an advertisement for it. So, that's bizarre and doesn't kind of add up and makes things suspicious. I guess, everyone says that, Frank Zappa was very against like the idea of personally taking psychedelic drugs, but yet here he is with his Navy brat wife, who went to the same kindergarten and maybe grade school as Jim Morrison. Around Washington D.C. I think either Washington or Norfolk, Virginia, because they're both Navy brats, and I think there might have even been one or two other figures that like were also in that same school, but it's a small world, I guess, in the canyon. And Zappa, even if you listen to his music, he's kind of openly contemptuous. If you listen to like Absolutely Free, he's making fun of the new agey stuff, of the hippie stuff, which like on the one hand, like there is space to make fun of it. It's just that I don't think anybody made fun of it in like the right way. Like, this is a psyop. Like,
it was it's kind of like a sort of superiority. Yeah, exactly. It was kind of like you disgusting pig fans. Like, you're like mocking the people who don't. You're mocking the people who don't see that it's a psyop. Basically, you're mocking like the rubes who think like you're not like a maniacal fascist. And like who will take LSD like because they think that that's what you promote when like you actually know that it's bad or something like that. Like that's it's punching down. It's punching down.
Definitely punching down.
On like the head of a baby doll that's meant to represent a Vietnamese child.
That is a huge thing though. Is that like he's almost like one of the he's almost one of the progenitors of like LOL, I'm CIA.
True.
In a certain sense.
Yes. It's interesting that he named one of his kids Ahmed. Although I guess I wouldn't say it's necessarily progressively weirder than Moon Unit. Ahmed is a normal name.
Well, if we want to go there, if we want to go there, he named himself out of the founder of Atlantic Records, Ahmet Erdogan, who was the son of like a high-ranking Turkish diplomat who grew up in Washington D.C. on Embassy Row and like went to like an elite prep school.
Yeah, but was he like a straight up like Young Turk type, early?
His dad was like his dad was part of the Young Turk government.
Yeah, that's weird. That's extremely bizarre to do. That's like something that only a fascist would do.
The son of a guy in
Ataturkism as like an American is odd.
And even McGowan even points out. I mean, he labels one. I think chapter 8, which is about the Hollywood scene at that time. Like their nickname was the Young Turks.
Yeah, right. He did mention
like
that,
Jack Nicholson, Dennis Hopper, Steve McQueen, all these big shot Warren Beatty or whatever. Like these were the Young Turks of Hollywood. And I guess there was that Rod Stewart song. He doesn't pop up in this, but I always found and obviously like the ridiculous like psyop-y show like the Young Turks with Cenk Uygur and everything. I don't know how any Armenian could be on that show with him. That's called the Young Turks. Very bizarre. And I think he has denied the Armenian genocide before. It's like, look, it's not that big a deal. I don't know.
Yeah, I remember there was some kind of weird thing. Yeah. Yes.
It's just it's a weird term that has had a long life and pops up a lot. But I feel like a lot of people don't even know anymore what it refers to. It's just a thing you say. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I guess there's upstarts. The Young Turks. It sort of means upstarts in a way. But I mean, the way in which they were upstarts is that they were hyper nationalists, to purge any trace of Arab culture, to purify the Turkey or whatever.
So that guy was the founder of one of the two biggest record labels that pumped out a lot of these artists. The other one was Capitol Records, which McGowan points out, and I actually was not aware of. The reason it's called Capitol with an O Records is because it was founded over a century ago in Washington D.C. and then eventually they moved to Los Angeles into the sort of iconic, spirally cylindrical building. But, so you had basically the two biggest record labels had these deep connections to Washington, D.C., even though they had moved out to Los Angeles. So, and then you look at all of the artists who had connections to either grew up around Washington, D.C., that kind of area, or, grew up on military bases, or were the sons and daughters of, like, political families. And, it starts to get a little bit, weird, I think we haven't talked about all the backgrounds of people yet. I mean, we've gotten through Frank Zappa, David Crosby.
Just before we move on from this, were Frank Zappa and Ahmet Ertegun friends, or like what? Like, why did he name his son after him?
Well, McGowan says that. It looks like they might have been friends.
Yeah. I guess he launched Frank Zappa's career. I see. Yeah, right.
Yeah, he launched Frank Zappa's career, and Frank Zappa admired him so much that he named one of his children after Ahmet. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
Word. All right. I'm just following up on that.
And this actually, this hits on something that I remembered as well. I'm just reading this little Denver Post article, but it said the key to Ahmet Ertegun's success was developing a real taste for like black music, basically like blues and R&B, and then finding a way to like kind of tweak it to appeal to like white teenagers. That was the real kind of, which I had thought about even with the Grateful Dead and with like the Rolling Stones and like really with rock and roll in general and like this period of it, because I think there is not necessarily evidence to say like rock and roll, came out of real genres that were organically created, like blues and R&B and folk and all of these things. Like I think if we're asking like how far does this kind of like nefarious influence go in like popular music, I think those genres that came out of like African American music for the most part, it's when they were taken. And then it seemed like all these people around the early 60s had this idea of like, what if we get like a bunch of attractive, like long-haired, cute boys or whatever to like play this like black music. And then, basically then it's a kind of common thing, like in the sense of, kind of stealing the intellectual artistic labor a little bit. And then this is just me being like, hyper focused on this. But it is interesting, I'm just reading, Ahmet Ertegun's Wikipedia article now. And he says, this is a very cringe comment, but, although he attended Landon School, an affluent all-male private school in Bethesda, Maryland, Ahmet would joke, "I got my real education at Howard University being a historically black college." Despite his affluent upbringing, Ertegun began to see a different world from his affluent peers. Ertegun would say, "I began to discover a little bit about the situation of black people in America and experienced immediate empathy with the victims of such senseless discrimination. Because although Turks were never slaves, they were, in fact they were, I guess, Mamelukes and things like that. And but anyway, they also were slave takers, but they were never regarded. They were regarded as enemies within Europe because of their Muslim beliefs. And if you follow up on the Wikipedia article of his father, this is really something. Of course he was, this is an interesting little factoid. Taking part in an Ottoman delegation with a mission to search for reconciliation with the nationalists in Ankara, by the end of 1920, changed his destiny. While the two Ottoman ministers heading the delegation returned to Istanbul after not achieving an understanding with the revolutionaries led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, that is Ataturk, he chose to join the national struggle and remained in Ankara, leaving behind his young wife and 3-year son, Nesuhi, that is. So after that, he became an aide to Ataturk. Then he eventually became the ambassador to Switzerland, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. As a Republic's ambassador to Washington,
he opened the embassies probably to African-American jazz musicians who gathered there to play freely in a socio-historical context, which was deeply divided by racial segregation at the time. And another interesting fact is that when he did eventually die in 1946, a year after World War II, his body was carried back to Istanbul by the USS Missouri and buried in the garden of a Sufi tekke in Sultan Tepe. I hope I'm pronouncing his Turkish words right, but I don't know. Uska Udar, near his sheikh grandfather, Ibrahim Edhem Effendi, who was once head of the tekke. So I guess he was also a descendant of like the head of a Sufi tekke, like a Sufi order, which is ironic because like that was kind of one of the main things that Ataturk was involved in, like stomping out for like not that it hadn't been cracked down on heavily before, but really wiping out the face of Turkish society. But
interesting.
Yeah, like it's interesting to consider like the links between like dervish or like Sufi music, like the appreciation for jazz, and like the long hair thing. Another thing that stuck out at me was like the Garden of Allah apartment complex.
Oh that, where Dorothy Walker lived.
Yeah, a lot of these people like stayed there, or a lot of figures in this whole milieu. I guess, Dorothy Parker, or sorry, not Dorothy Parker, but the Morgan Cabot, the godson of poet and writer Dorothy Parker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who McGowan says is she was kind of like a socialist, like in the 20s, but I think also had a lot of I think she attempted suicide a few times. McGowan says that she was born Dorothy Rothschild, but he doesn't say if she was actually related to any of the...
I guess it was Dorothy Parker. Yeah, it's the Morgan Cabot was the son, but it's a bit of a confusing sentence. But Dorothy Parker, I guess, lived in the Garden of Allah apartments and attempted more than once to kill herself there.
Exactly. Interesting.
That was a big hub for a lot of this stuff.
Well, there's a lot of creepy stuff all up and down the canyon.
Doesn't Don Henley have a Garden of Allah song, as an homage to the Garden of Allah?
He might on Inside Job, maybe. He might. He did live in Laurel Canyon, but in the 70s, after most of the action of this kind of started to sort of cool off, or the weirdest years, which are, I would say like 65 to like 69. But I mean, still such shit going on through the Wonderland murders in like 1980 or 81. Kind of was like the real capstone of like that Laurel Canyon era.
I'm a spy in the house of love. I know the dream that you're dreaming of. I know the word in the house of love.
So do you want to jump into the Doors a little bit?
Yeah.
Next?
Well, one of the figures who I think, related to the Doors is one of the most interesting to come up in the book is Paul Rothschild. And he has like a bunch of interlocks to a bunch of people in the broader Laurel Canyon scene. One of my favorite paragraphs in like the whole, or series of paragraphs, page or so in the whole book has to do with him, which it begins saying, yet another curious character to take up residence in Laurel Canyon was producer Paul Rothschild, who played a key role in shaping the sound of both The Doors and Love. In June 1981, Sports Illustrated publisher Philip Howlett penned a short piece to introduce readers to new writer Bjarne Rostang. I hope I'm saying that right. Born in Lincoln, New York, Rostang grew up in various places in Connecticut, where he attended what he recalls as an even dozen schools. I got my BA and Master's in English from the University of Connecticut, he says. Then I did part of a PhD at the University of Washington before going into the Army Intelligence Corps in 1959. We had Paul Rothschild, who later became producer for The Doors, and Janis Joplin, to give you some idea of what the unit was like. All right. It was, in all likelihood, like countless other intelligence units designed to churn out shapers of public opinion, whether actors, novelists, newsmen, or in this case, sports writers and producers of popular music. It is quite shocking, of course, to learn that the handler of two of Laurel Canyon's most influential and groundbreaking bands had a background in intelligence work. Apparently, the search is on for anyone of any prominence in the Laurel Canyon scene who didn't have direct connections to the intelligence community. Bjarne Rostang would, perhaps, not surprisingly, develop his own indirect connections to the Laurel Canyon music scene. His most notable contribution to the field of literature was penning the mass-market paperback version of Phantom of the Paradise, the campy tale of a Phil Spector-inspired music producer who had sold his soul to the devil for fame and fortune, and who subsequently manipulated a disfigured young singer-songwriter into likewise selling his soul. The theatrical version, released on Halloween Day, 1974, and carrying the tagline, "He sold his soul for rock and roll," starred Laurel Canyon's own Paul Williams as Swan, the demonic producer who surrounds himself with nubile young women eager to do his bidding. Williams, who lived on Lookout Mountain alongside numerous other singer-songwriters, also scored the film. It is, I'm sure, entirely coincidental that two guys who emerged from the same intelligence unit in the early 1960s would follow such curious career paths. One, Paul Rothschild, becoming what many on the scene in those days would have described as demonic rock music producer, and the other, Bjarne Rostang, penning a novel about a demonic rock music producer. And that, it goes into Owsley Stanley, right after that, but yeah, that's the sort of Paul Rothschild bit that I like, just having to do with his intelligence backgrounds and, the perception of him as being, a demonic producer by this guy who was in the same unit as him in the Army Intelligence Corps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that movie was directed by Brian De Palma, who also made interesting. I've rewatched a lot of De Palma over 2020 and found him. I kind of renewed interest in him. Can't say for sure how sus he is, but he did in the late 70s make a movie I haven't watched yet, but might be something to talk about down the line. I think it was called The Fury. And it's about CIA psychic spies.
Right. Yes. I think that, you mentioned this relative to the podcast in the past. I think that there might be some notes on it in our workflowy document, Brian De Palma's The Fury. But right, yes.
Exactly. It's it's about ex-CIA agents, or ex-CIA agent as a psychic son, and then there's there's false flag terrorist attacks, there's ESP, telekinesis, I guess I wonder.
It certainly makes me curious to watch Phantom of the Paradise now. Yes, an extremely negatively received box office failure, but it received Academy Award and Golden Globe nominations for its music.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he put the Doors together, and And the Doors definitely fall into the category, I think, like we mentioned a little bit earlier, that like they were not seasoned musicians and really hadn't been in any bands before they basically were assembled. And you know, just a McGowan summary, I think, is here pretty good. He says, you know, Morrison essentially arrived on the scene as a fully developed rock star, complete with a backing band, a stage persona, and an impressive collection of songs, enough, in fact, to fill the Doors' first few albums. How exactly he reinvented himself in such a radical manner remains something of a mystery, since before his sudden incarnation as singer-songwriter, James Douglas Morrison had never shown the slightest interest in music, none whatsoever. He certainly never studied music, and could neither read nor write it. By his own account, he had never much of an interest in even listening to music. He told one interviewer that he, quote, never went to concerts, one or two at most, and before joining the Doors, he never did any singing. I never even conceived of it. Asked near the end of his life if he ever had any desire to learn to play a musical instrument, Jim responded, not really. So here we had a guy who had never sang, who had never even conceived of the notion that he could open his mouth and make sounds come out, who couldn't play an instrument and had no interest in learning such a skill, and who had never much listened to music or been anywhere near a band, even just to watch one perform, and yet he somehow emerged, virtually overnight, as a fully formed rock star who would quickly become an icon of his generation. Even more bizarrely, legend holds that he brought with him enough original songs to fill the first few Doors albums. Morrison did not, you see, do as other singer-songwriters do and pen the songs over the course of the band's career. Instead, he allegedly wrote them all at once before the band was even formed. As Jim once acknowledged in an interview, he was, quote, not a very prolific songwriter. Most of the songs I've written I wrote in the very beginning, about 3 years ago. I just had a period when I wrote a lot of songs. In fact, all of the good songs that Morrison is credited with writing were written during that period, the period during which, according to rock legend, Jim spent most of his time hanging out on the rooftop of a Venice apartment building consuming copious amounts of LSD. This was just before he hooked up with fellow student Ray Manzarek to form the Doors. Legend also holds, strangely enough, that chance meeting occurred on the beach, though it seems far more likely that the pair would have actually met at UCLA, where both attended the university's rather small and close-knit film school. In any event, the question that naturally arises is, how exactly did Jim the Lizard King Morrison write that impressive batch of songs? I'm certainly no musician myself, but it is my understanding that just about every singer-songwriter across the land composes his or her songs in essentially the same manner, on an instrument, either a piano or guitar usually. Some songwriters I hear can compose on paper, but that requires a skill set that Jim did not possess. The problem, of course, is that he could also not play a musical instrument of any kind. How did he write the songs then? And, you know, he goes on to say, yeah, he probably, did them in his head, but that's difficult to do if you can't write music or you don't, like, know any like Brian Wilson was able to do, basically. But Brian Wilson was like a trained musician, and he's clarifying here, because I can already hear the haters, the Jim Morrison stands being like, he was a poet. Okay, but McGowan says these should be clarified songs that we are talking about here, as opposed to just lyrics, which would more accurately be categorized as poems. Because Jim, as is fairly well known, was quite a prolific poet, whereas he was a songwriter for only one brief period of his life. But why was that? Why did Morrison, with no previous interest in music, suddenly and inexplicably become a prolific songwriter, only to just as suddenly lose interest after mentally penning an impressive catalog of what would be regarded as rock staples? And how and why did Jim achieve the accompanying physical transformation that changed him from a clean-cut, collegiate, and rather conservative-looking young man into the brooding sex symbol who would take the country by storm? And why, after a few years of adopting that persona, did Jim transform once again in the last year or so of his life into an overweight, heavily bearded, reclusive poet who seemed to have lost his interest in music just as suddenly and inexplicably as he had obtained it? So that's all weird. And he says, as Vanity Fair once noted, the Doors were always different from the other Laurel Canyon bands. All four members of the group, for example, lacked previous band experience. Morrison and Manzarek, as noted, were film students, and drummer John Densmore and guitarist Robbie Krieger were recruited by Manzarek from his Transcendental Meditation class, which is, I guess, where one goes to find musicians to fill out one's band. That class, however, apparently lacked a bass player, so they did without, except for those times when they used session musicians and then claimed that they did without. Anyway, the point is that none of the 4 members of the Doors had any real band credentials. Even a band as contrived as the Byrds, as we shall soon see, had members with band credentials. So did Buffalo Springfield, with Neil Young and Bruce Palmer, for example, having played in the Mina Byrds, backing a young vocalist who would reinvent himself as Rick Superfreak James, which is I didn't know Neil Young played in Rick James's backup band. That's interesting. But basically, the Doors could cite no such band lineage. They were just 4 guys who happened to come together to play the songs written by the singer who had never sung, but who had a sudden calling and a magical gift for songwriting. And as you would expect with 4 guys who had never actually played in a band before, they didn't really play very well. And that's kind of an understatement. And don't take his word for it. Let's let the band's producer, Paul Rothschild, weigh in. Paul Rothschild said, quote, "The Doors were not great live performers musically. They were exciting theatrically and kinetically, but as musicians, they didn't make it. There was too much inconsistency. There was too much bad music. Robbie would be horrendously out of tune with Ray. John would be missing cues. There was bad mic usage, too, where you couldn't hear Jim at all." And
the second paragraph is good too, where McGowan says that he heard like some early Doors recording, and he was like, "It seems like not being able to hear Jim at all might have been in many cases actually an improvement to the performance."
Yeah.
And like I said, that they were just an abysmal live band, and like so it seems like really like this was kind of being like cooked up by people like in the Paul Rothschild orbit, like with these weird like spooky backgrounds to like churn out this weird band. In fact, even the name The Doors, I think as we've noted before, maybe not in this episode, but in past ones, that it comes from The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley.
Sure does. Who had died a few years prior, but was lived in Los Angeles and worked at like the Esalen Institute and was I think it is it's pretty official now that he was involved with MK Ultra, particularly the psychedelic part of it and the culture manipulation, social engineering possibilities of it. And so here comes, McGowan also points out that the Doors were probably the only band from Laurel Canyon that didn't change any of its members for its entire existence. Like, literally every other band, for the most part, even the Mamas and the Papas, like, kicked out Michelle Phillips for a while. Every other band, like, the Byrds had a different lineup on literally every album. Like, Love went through, like, multiple incarnations, and pretty much, everybody at Steppenwolf, which was another one, Frank Zappa's band, obviously. Like, it was usually there was a high churn rate, and, maybe that's also because they had the Wrecking Crew actually laying down the music. And, but not the Doors. They had the same 4 people that apparently couldn't play their instruments together very well throughout their entire run. And, McGowan says that, Jim Morrison's band arrived on the scene as a fully formed entity with a name taken from Aldous Huxley, this is The Doors of Perception, a stable lineup, a backlog of soon-to-be hit songs, and no previous experience writing, arranging, playing, or performing music. Other than that, though, they were just your run-of-the-mill, organic, grassroots 1960s rock and roll band, albeit one with a curious aversion to political advocacy. Jim Morrison was, by virtually all accounts, a voracious reader. Former teachers and college professors expressed amazement at the breadth and depth of his knowledge on various topics, and at the staggering array of literary sources he could accurately cite. And yet he was known to tell reviewers that he, quote, hadn't studied politics that much, really. But that was okay, according to drummer John Densmore, since, quote, a lot of people at our concerts, at least, it seems like they don't really want to come to hear us speak politics. That's the way it was in the 1960s, you see. The young folks of that era just didn't concern themselves much with politics, and certainly didn't want their anti-war icons engaging in anything resembling political discourse. Yeah, exactly. So here we go again with the Grateful Dead, like, what at politics, man? Like, nah. Yeah. Like, much to the, in sharp contrast to the perception of them in today's kind of culture. Like, our cultural memory of them, that they, they basically got arrested because Jim Morrison whipped his dick out during shows. Like, he didn't actually get arrested for protesting against the war that his dad helped start.
Yes.
You know, I mean,
once again, yeah.
And it was a guy, I guess it's like, you know, he had such a wild, I would like to go back and watch the Oliver Stone movie, The Doors, which I haven't seen in so many years, but I want to do a psyop. I want to do like a psyop scan of it and see, because that was like in his peak like JFK era where he was delving into like conspiracy type stuff, but I don't remember that movie really having any like susness about like, I mean, I feel like there are flashbacks to his childhood, but I don't think the movie like outed that his dad was, you know, Admiral Morrison at the Gulf of Tonkin. You know, I feel like, you know, on the one hand, Oliver Stone would be the kind of person to like highlight that, but on the other hand, can we trust Oliver Stone, particularly by the 90s? Yeah. I don't know. He's gone in some weird directions in recent years, but yeah, Morrison. There's just such a contradiction there with like how they get hyped up and like what they actually were. And I guess, I mean, also it's like enshrined by using the end in Apocalypse Now, you know, by Francis Ford Coppola, which is also, they were all in kind of this LA world as well.
Yeah,
and
that sort of like weird improvisational like jam thing that also I guess the band Love had. It seems like that was a Paul Rothchild thing, who also came out of the Cambridge scene that you mentioned with like the Boston Strangler and stuff, you know, the Harvard adjacent folk scene.
Well, I think there's a weird connection there that intersects with another Laurel Canyon luminary, Graham Parsons, who was one that did not make it out alive. And when he, we'll circle back to him in a longer point, but basically he got exposed. He went to Harvard. He was a pretty wealthy kid from a Florida citrus dynasty family. They owned a lot of citrus, you know, groves and stuff. And he got sent off to Harvard, and he got into the Cambridge folk scene that had been popping off there in the early 60s, mainly at a place called Club 47, which opened in 1958. It's a jazz and blues venue. The first folk artist to take the stage there was a very young Joan Baez, whose reputedly CIA-connected father worked at MIT. And then Dylan came there in 1961. I guess 1962, McGowan calls it the Cambridge equivalent of the Hate's Summer of Love, and that the Cambridge scene and others in Greenwich Village and elsewhere were necessary precursors to the Laurel Canyon scene, which was essentially created by taking the music of that earlier scene, particularly the work of Dylan and Seeger, and mixing it with the instrumentation being utilized across the pond by a band known as the Beatles. And, of course, this is... vintage McGowan is entirely fitting then that, as with Laurel Canyon, the Cambridge scene came complete with its own resident psycho killer. In addition to the folk scene hitting its peak in the summer of 1962, something else newsworthy happened in Cambridge that summer. A lot of women started turning up dead. 6 of them in that first summer alone, and 7 more over the next couple of years. And as Susan Kelly noted in the Boston Stranglers, one of these victims was killed right across the street from Club 47. Just across the street from victim Beverly Salmon's apartment, a very young and not yet famous Joan Baez and an equally youthful and unknown Bob Dylan were playing to reverently hushed audiences at the Club 47. And, you know, I think... as the title of Kelly's book implies, there was actually no such person as the Boston Strangler, but that didn't stop authorities and the media from pinning all the murders on one Albert DeSalvo, far better known as the Boston Strangler. Just as Laurel Canyon would have Charles Manson as its unofficial mascot, the earlier scene in Cambridge had Albert DeSalvo. And Cambridge had something else that Laurel Canyon would later have, Paul Rothchild, who worked at Club 47 and went on to produce The Doors.
Yes.
So Paul Rothchild was up in Club 47... in this like proto Laurel Canyon scene, I presume after leaving the military, or because he joined the military in 1959, didn't he?
I don't know if I don't recall like if it said when he joined the military. At least I'd have to look in the book. But man, he did prison time on a minor drug charge. So that's a different passage. But anyway. Yes. I don't know if it says that... Well, it definitely says that he was in the Army Intelligence Corps in 1959, but I don't know if it says when he was in or left the military. That I recall.
He may, if he did like a 2-year stint, he may have ended up in Cambridge right after his military service. But that's
well, I mean, it also would make sense for him to. I mean, I guess assuming that like he truly indeed left like the Army Intelligence Corps, but like Cambridge is a natural place to be for like Army intelligence. I feel like a lot of stuff's happening around like Harvard and MIT.
Exactly. And on top of that, I mean, this was also, I didn't see McGowan get into it, but I would be interested to know if there was any connection between that folk beatnik scene at Club 47 and Harvard, at the time, Harvard professors Tim Leary and Richard Alpert doing their first limited MK Ultra LSD, experiments, like giving it out. Usually, I mean, it almost sounds like the vibe of the kind of beatnik club, like a room like in hushed, reverent, tones, like listening to. It sounds a lot like Tim Leary's like early kind of dinner parties where he would give people LSD. It was very like chill and kind of had this reverence around it, and it wasn't like it wasn't quite a merry prankster like freak out party yet. That would come later in California. But yeah, I think so. I mean, because I think Leary was probably kicked out in either 62 or 63, and it says here that like the sort of Summer of Love in Cambridge was in 1962. So that would have been probably around the time he was distributing LSD to undergrads, and right before he got fired, which itself might have been like kind of an op to like give him this renegade credibility and dissociate themselves from him.
It's interesting that Paul Rothschild served prison time like on a minor drug charge, like during during the production of what was the album that he worked on. I had to look up because I came across that when I was trying to determine when he left the military. I guess it was during the production of a Love album. Yeah, their self-titled debut. Well, I guess that was when he was in prison on drug charges. I wonder, what the nature exactly of that was. But and their second album was again produced by Paul Rothschild. His parole officer, ever accommodating, had signed off on him venturing out to California. The cover art for the new disc was once again, like the first one, photographed at a fire-ravaged home in Laurel Canyon. The sound of the record was much different than the first, fusing jazz with psychedelic rock. Word. What were you say?
Interesting. I mean, it sounds a little bit like, why am I blanking on it right now? Charles Manson getting having a very generous parole officer that's like, you can go down to LA, that's fine.
Yeah, Rothschild apparently also listened to, I don't know if he ever did anything with it, but he definitely listened to the family's music. It was arranged to be played for him. As I guess it went around with all these people, they had a chance to sort of listen to it.
Interesting. And I see, Paul Rothschild was technically working for Elektra Records, which McGowan mentioned was one of the only new record labels founded in the 1950s that was like one of two, I think, along with maybe Atlantic, that basically like survived like the end of there's a great kind of consolidation from like the 50s to the 70s, and there were like over 1,000 record labels founded, and basically 2 or 3. I mean, same old story, right? Nothing new under the sun. Railroads, internet companies, etc. It always tends towards monopoly. But I guess Elektra was kind of maybe like the third player. I guess they did a lot of folk and rock kind of early on. I forget who they had. And I think maybe, they eventually merged with Asylum Records by our boy David Geffen, who kind of would be the beneficiary. Like, he would take all this to the next level in the 70s. But actually, McGowan doesn't get into David Geffen too much. I guess he even though David Geffen, who basically, started out Asylum Records in the very early 70s, which grew out a company he had called Lookout Management. Lookout Mountain, interesting.
Okay. Yeah.
And he signed a lot of people from this milieu. I think he signed. I think he had worked with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and other people like that. And then got really big with like Jackson Browne, Linda Ronstadt, the Eagles. The Eagles really were what like blew it up, but also like Tom Waits, like they had John Fogerty. They signed Bob Dylan away from Columbia Records, but then he went back. Warren Zevon, who had like was the son of like a lieutenant to like Los Angeles mob kingpin Mickey Cohen, Emmylou Harris, like basically that L.A. country rock and like folk sound, like that is what made Geffen like the big dog in Hollywood that he basically is today. And but that's a little bit out of the scope of McGowan's book. So like. He, I suppose, was a very young person working his way up from like the mailroom of wherever at this time Geffen was. But yeah, I mean, is there anything else? Let's see. I don't know to say about the Doors. I mean, like, it's just bizarre. It's sus.
It's definitely
the
bizarre.
fact that his dad.
Sus. It's amazing
his
that
dad
he had
was
no
the
interest
commander
in music, and like his dad was the commander of what
the destroyer ship that was like he was there, like he was literally the captain of that ship who relayed the fake information that they were attacked, that gave LBJ the excuse to send like 500,000 troops there in retaliation. So he's like quite literally was like right there, like he did the Vietnam War in a way. I mean, obviously force is much larger than him, but that always like kind of blows my mind of like you don't have any feelings about this. Like are you not aware of this very interesting historical situation, like with you and your father? It makes you think that like there had to be something else operating going on that made him want to just avoid ever talking about that and like totally deflect it. And it's kind of amazing that he was able to, for I don't think any that came out during his lifetime. Yeah, well, in a way, it wasn't really that much of a contradiction because like it wasn't like he was a super outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War, really. But, I mean, I guess like he's known as being like crazy, and like by association, maybe you're talking about how the M was an Apocalypse Now, so maybe that's an association, and like people think of like, if you have long hair and you're in a rock band, then like you're part of the 60s counterculture, which is anti-Vietnam, or which like against normies or whatever, against squares, but well, it goes back to that idea. Like, what needs to be deconstructed is the square, the hip square binary. We need to deconstruct it because a lot of these hips are actually squares, or are like carefully coordinated products of squareness, or metamorphosed squares doing insight roles. Yes, exactly. I don't know if the plural of someone whose hip is, I guess, a hippie. I'm calling them hips, but I feel hippie, hipster. Hips, I think it all comes out of the same like etymology. But yeah, certainly the hippie idea, and even I think it goes to like one of these like widely held beliefs that like the hippies ended the Vietnam War. And I think when we dig more into this, it's like, I don't know, like a lot of these hippies weren't even opposed to it. These most famous ones that usually get kind of all the credit. And sure, they kind of like took over the aesthetic of the anti-war movement. but to what extent was the hippie part of it critical to stopping the Vietnam War? And I mean, I almost tend to reject, like, in some, like, this whole, I don't know, the paradigm of, like, the protesters were the ones that were, like, that stopped it, when it kind of, like, I don't know, it kind of erases, like, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong in the South, and also things like the collapse of discipline within the U.S. Army and draftee soldiers, like, fragging their lieutenants and shit like that.
Yeah. I definitely do not think that it was the protesters that, like, are primarily responsible for the end of the Vietnam War. Like, maybe I do think that possibly a perception of the war's unpopularity on the home front, like, contributed, but, like, you know, there's many, many factors, and certainly it didn't bring it to, like, you know, a screeching halt or anything. Like, it raged on through all these protests. Like, you know, there didn't really seem to be any real, like, stable connection between the intensity of the protests and, you know, the, like, Nixon seemed content to just, like, you know, plow forward with that regardless of the protests. I don't think that like,
well, that's the thing, is, like, I think particularly from, like, 1968 onward, you see this, like, explosion of violence that is sort of both associated directly with the protests, like the Kent State Massacre, and there's a similar one in Berkeley, which I stumbled across the other day, where, like, several people were killed by, I think, National Guard troops. That, you know, there are several incidents kind of like this. And then, of course, like, you know, all the COINTELPRO chaos, you know, targeted assassinations and shit of, like, Black Panthers that were going on, and really kind of, you know, they were able to stretch the war out for a number of more years, and the anti-war left kind of, like, went into a very beat down and kind of scattered place, like, in the 70s. Like, the organizational politics and, like, even the protest politics all kind of, like, started to splinter apart. People got really into drugs. People got more into, like, lifestyle stuff, like spiritual things, and, you know, so, I mean, the idea that, like, the protesters were the ones that, like, did it, like, they were almost, like, neutralized by the early 70s. And sure, there were still protests against the war. I don't know. It's, like, it's interesting to look at in context of, like, our lifetimes and, like, what we've gone through with, like, protesting wars, like Iraq, for example, where those were the biggest protests in the history of the world against, like, a military intervention. And they were like, okay, well, that's nice. We're still going to go do it. And, like, half the Democrats voted for it.
Yeah, that's a good,
you know?
example. Yeah, like, you know, I mean, yeah, like, certainly, like, these massive protests against Iraq, I mean, didn't have, like, a significant effect. I mean, I still think that we could have done more, like, but I'm sure that they could have done more in the 60s as well. But yeah, I
wouldn't put these celebrities certainly at the vanguard of fighting against any of that.
Yeah, anyone who, definitely not. Well, especially not ones like Jim Morrison, who don't say anything about it, or ones like Frank Zappa, who are in favor of it.
Yes, and all these guys are, like, obsessed with guns. Like, they all, and I'm not saying, like owning guns or liking guns is bad, but, like, given the vibes they're putting off, it's a little strange that they all were, like, gun freaks who would, like, walk around, like, with pistols, and like, before Manson, they didn't really have any reason to be, like, it was very, you know, more or less safe up in the canyon. But I guess, like, David Crosby had, like, a huge fascination with guns. Dennis Hopper was obsessed with guns. I think maybe I don't know about Terry Melcher, but and Frank Zappa as well. You know, they all kind of, like, fetishized it and had these kind of control freak personalities. But as long as they dressed up like wild men and grew a big bushy mustache, then they could just, I don't know, like, they could be perceived as something totally different. It's very strange in retrospect, like, how open they are about their politics or their refusal to, like, take a stand on political issues, and how they still get worshipped anyways for, like, doing something.
Yeah, it's very odd, and yeah, it definitely does raise a lot of questions around the whole thing. Yeah, I like I mean I've always like my dad like loves Jim Morrison and would always like put him on and be like, listen to this maniac, and it's like, well, yeah, I mean like he yells a lot, so I guess in a way like he's a maniac, and I feel like that maybe is an accurate characterization, like that in some respects maybe he's a maniac, but
he's the pure libidinal like young man, like the military age male, like kind of almost like a Kenneth Anger ish kind of idealized male erotic form that's like thrusting his leather pants in your face, like I said earlier, with like the same energy as like a napalm raid from like an F-105 in the jungles of North Vietnam, in the Operation Rolling Thunder. It's like this guy is just like bursting out with this kind of overwhelming like sexual libidinal like, but also kind of death focused. Like there's like a funeral dirge, there's a funereal and spooky, almost like Church of Satan kind of vibe to like the church organ, that is prominently in all their songs. Like there's a spooky, like we're going to hell in a bucket kind of vibe.
Yes, there definitely is. Like, and I think that's even in the name, like the reference to Doors of Perception. There's definitely a very spooky vibe in the Doors, and I feel like there's a dialectical aspect to it where maybe it is just something that's purely optical in a way. Like the sort of fascination with them is not really something that's sort of political or about like some sort of even pretense of opposition to like U.S. Imperialism or the Vietnam War or something like that. It's about like a different sort of appearance or a different kind of bearing or orientation towards the same stuff, basically. Like, it's like a different, like the same kind of warfare in a way, but like a different modality of warfare, like aesthetically. Like, rather than, I mean, you could even say, like, Apocalypse Now is an interesting way to, like, understand this, like, you have, like, Colonel Kurtz, who's, like, he's, like, lost his mind, he's in a way, like, gone native, and then you, like, as opposed to, like, someone who's, like, a square, like, your typical, like, the soldier of, like, the 50s, like, you like maybe Apocalypse Now versus John Wayne's The Green Berets or something, like there's a soldier in Vietnam who's like losing his mind and like just like shooting everybody, like versus someone who's more straight-laced, but it's still like the same end being pursued in a way. And I think that maybe there's interest in that kind of different type of like masculinity or whatever, like in cultivating that different type of orientation towards the world, or masculinity is I was just thinking about how in the 1980s, I would say progressively throughout the trilogy, that Stallone's Rambo acquires a more increasing resemblance to Jim Morrison. Down to like the feathered hair, the bear shirt, the chiseled jawline, the brooding kind of like dissociated kind of personality. Right, and and Rambo, even in First Blood, I think that there is a certain similarity to Jim Morrison, and he's not, but he still is fundamentally, he's fighting against,
the cops who are vagrancy and shit. True. And that's true, but how, like, he still is, and I think that it says something how seamless the transition is from the Rambo of First Blood to, I mean, we're just talking about Stallone again, but I think it is interesting how seamless the transition is from the Rambo of First Blood to the Rambo of, like, do we get to win this time? Like, Rambo 2, where it's like, okay, like, this guy who was at one time, like, this figurehead or, like, this sort of conduit of sort of a critique of the war, now is, like, just gonna go, like, just pile up bodies, exactly.
Even though
and I mean,
it's
but
not
then
really something that you even question. It's like that's what he really wants to do is get back in charge of the helicopters, or whatever.
I don't know. He probably still couldn't get a job parking cars, but then if you extend that transformation even further back from like the link between the figure of Jim Morrison, and then First Blood Rambo, and then like Rambo 3 Rambo, even that has like a weird like full circle. Not to get too thick into Jim Morrison being like similar to Sylvester Stallone in general, but just like that image of like the young, like shirtless, like leather pants, like feather haired, son of a Navy admiral who's like would have been somebody who would like gone to Vietnam or something, but then became an acid freak singer instead.
Yeah.
And then ending up like a vagrant, like tossed out and then brought back into the military like in the 80s to exact revenge and like, relight that Cold War flame and do war crimes.
But I think that, like, when you think of it, in terms of, like, the connection between, the sort of subtle, like, cultural, the subtle cultural use of sort of soft power and the sort of dimension of the iconography of masculinity or whatever, it's interesting to contemplate because, in a way, if you think of, like, Rambo as, like, a soldierized or or Jim Morrison as like a culturalized like soldier or an idea of because wars are mostly fought by males. No offense,
Captain
like
Marvel's
still
out there.
Sorry, based, I guess, just drone me, like, I'm just having the opinion of the evil Palestinians, like, maybe in Gaza, but not in, but, we have sexy ladies who are here to bulldoze your house, but, anyway, no, like, but still, it's, like, perceived as, especially, I think at the time even more so, but I think that, sorry, I'm like on a tangent, like, I'm
no,
kind of
okay.
a tangent, but I think that what you say about Captain Marvel is interesting relative to Rambo, because Captain Marvel is in a way creating like a different sort of paradigm where like there's even more sort of porosity in terms of like the participation between women, like it's bringing women into this complex as well. It's a transformation of this sort of cultural idea of the soldier from one that is connected to masculinity to one that has like maybe a less specific tie to a certain type of to a certain gender, or gender presentation, performance or whatever. But
but
I
still,
think that
doesn't it still feel a little bit like a new
Yeah.
masculinity? Like Captain Marvel in a way, rather
Well,
than a
for sure. Or,
feminization.
like, it's a new soldierinity, which for most of history has been like most American history has been tied to masculinity, and I think that is like the point that I'm kind of circling around is like. In the same way that, like, in the Revolutionary War or whatever, the sort of style of, like, everyone is gonna, like, line up and then we're just gonna march with our guns, like, 3 paces and then fire or whatever. Like, that's probably not what they actually did, but you know what I'm saying. Like, they had these sort of, very systematized, like, rules of engagement or whatever that sometimes were bamboozled. And in the same way, this, could be seen in the contrast between the engagements the United States had been in with the ones that it was in, during the Cold War, since the Vietnam War. Is your traditional sort of square soldier as well equipped to engage in a conflict like the Vietnam War as, a more like crazy, like, loose cannon guy to have like who has kind of a guerrilla mentality to, have these more these different kind of modes of engagement in the same way that for the battlefield of today, you want like your Captain Marvel who is like, together, like strong, like indefatigable boss bitch who's like, winning on the battlefield and like in the on the home front, like, or what I don't know, like I haven't seen the movie, so I'm just talking completely out of my ass, but I feel like the idea of like the lean in like soldier who can like drone you while she's like sipping her latte or whatever is like
But I think that's real because that's going to be the future of warfare, and I think that as warfare becomes more remote and automated and things of that nature, it probably makes a lot of sense to want to bring. You don't want to limit yourself to like half of the population of people that could be involved in that. When the remaining kind of all male positions are probably more in like special forces and infantry, and those people are they're a chunk of the entire military force. But I think there's going to be things like drone squadrons and information warfare, things like that are going to be
honestly, women might be in the same way. Well, well, just not to speak for ourselves, but to speak for prevailing opinions, especially among, decision makers and military complexes. I think, in the same way that it's perceived that men have greater upper body strength, or, like, the ability to sort of, like, carry weaponry or operate heavy machinery, there might be a perception that women, certainly, like, in terms of gender stereotypes, there's certainly a perception that women are better at organizing things, entering data, like recording, monitoring things, like, the same intensity that's valuable in a Rambo, like in terms of gender stereotypes, like, there's a secretarial aspect to being a drone soldier,
No,
like,
there is. To being, like, the mission intelligence coordinator, you're kind of sitting there with a bunch of, like, flat screen monitors, like, chatting with the NSA person, getting a live translation of somebody's phone call that you're hovering over, and all kinds of things like that. So, it has a lot of...
It's like Don
those
Draper
kind of...
being like, like, Donna, like, kill that Arab, like, like, or whatever, like, that's kind
also
of
maybe increased fine motor sensitivity, which I think was I remember reading about Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Soviet sniper who scored the world record of dead Nazis, I think 309 in World War II. I think she said that, women are better snipers because they have better fine motor sensitivity, in their finger and stuff. So, like,
not to be gender essentialist, of course, not, there's no...
Ladies, go down to your local recruiter office and sign up to be... You could be the next Chris Kyle. Christina Kyle.
Wow, wow. Yeah, well, I'm sure
the sequel will be
seeing
coming.
that on the screen, on the silver screen.
Yeah. We definitely will, but also just something random I wanted to build up that jumped out at me yesterday. We were reading about, like, the persona of these guys, and I guess there's a MGM Records exec, David Anger, who McGowan says perhaps summed up Zappa best. Quote, "I always felt there was something a little totalitarian about Frank. I was awed by the clarity of the vision and his ability to make it happen, but it was without warmth." And that just, like, triggered something in me. I was thinking about, like, Frank Zappa's bushy mustache and just kind of, like, how he looks, and then the fact that he was, like, this right-wing control freak and was, like, super anti-communist. But I almost peep something like, okay, I think I wrote in the notes, subliminal Stalin hypothesis. Maybe it's just the way this guy is describing him, but he said there's something a little totalitarian. I was awed by the clarity of the... Just imagine somebody saying that about Stalin real quick. There's something a little totalitarian about Joseph.
Right,
I was awed by the clarity of the vision and his ability to make it happen, but it was without warmth. Now, I mean, you could dispute whether Stalin was truly without warmth, but I would say the popular Western perception of him, that sounds exactly like what a Westerner would, like, say about Stalin. Like, oh, you got to hand it to him. Like, he had a vision and ability to make it happen, but there was no warmth, and he was a totalitarian. It also made me think about just the weird, maybe this is completely a coincidence, but, like, the fact that the band that kicked this off, the lead singer's name was Lennon.
Okay.
Isn't it just a little weird? Like, John, instead of don't stan Vladimir Lenin, kids, stan John Lennon. Look at this cute guy playing his guitar and singing. And then Zappa, it's like, oh, he might be a tyrant, but it's almost like, okay, it's like in politics, like the type of behavior exhibited by a Frank Zappa would be considered like psychotic, totalitarian, and like evil, but like because he's a quote artist, it's like cool, and like that's just how he is, man. Like he's got this clarity of vision. It's like you're allowed to be like a little tiny cult leader dictator in this milieu, like whether you're Vito Paulekas or Charles Manson or Frank Zappa. And like it seems like all these people do have like these kind of like petty dictator complexes, but they're all rather right wing. I mean, they're not like Maoists who are like experimenting with like, you know, left-wing communes out in the desert. Like these are all pretty like right-wing, like pro-capitalist, like kind of people. And I don't know, I just wonder if there's kind of like something like Frank Zappa as a kind of like clownish parody of like Stalin or something, but also like just how we always talk about like how the CIA was like studying say Maoism or certain things, and then it wants to kind of like rip those things off but use it towards its own ends. Or sometimes like the Manchurian Candidate hypothesis, where it's like, oh, like the Soviets are doing this mind control assassin thing, so like we got to go do a mind control assassin thing. It's like we build the projected idea of whatever it is we think they're doing, which is way more sinister probably than it actually was. Or like a projection of our fear, and then we go build like a scary straw man of it for ourselves. That because we think like that's how like the communists must be dosing everybody with drugs and like hypnotizing them and like electroshocking them. So like we got to go do that. And it turns out like that's probably not what they were doing. But now we're doing it, and then it's effective towards our own ends. And I don't know. I'm out on a limb here, but there's just like I mean, to think about these guys replacing what otherwise might have been at least a certain like greater sympathy with like left wing movements around the world, and you know, whether it's Cuba or in China or the Soviets or whatever. Like it's like all these Laurel Canyon people managed to like pull off like a magic trick whereby they received the energy of being like the radical vanguard like leaders, like the Young Turks, you know, but in fact they kind of like weren't really leading anything. And you know, I mean, where did they lead it?
For sure. It's interesting. You know, it's almost like kind of like a it's like, because there's a certain romance to revolutionaries, you know, in literature, like just in culture in general, but there's nothing actually revolutionary except like on a very superficial level, and a lot of it is actually like very much directed like as kind of an experiment almost.
How to find yourself.